The snow had been falling for 6 hours by the time Tessa Calloway decided they were going to die. She didn't say it out loud. She was 12 years old, and she'd already learned that some thoughts, once spoken, have a way of making themselves real. So she kept the thought tucked behind her back teeth and focused on putting one foot in front of the other, because that was all there was left to do. One foot, then the other. The snow came up past her knees in some places, and every step felt like pulling her boot out of wet concrete. Behind her, Danny was crying again. He was 6, and he'd been crying on and off since sundown, which she couldn't hold against him. She'd been fighting the urge herself. Ahead of her there was nothing but darkness and white. A darkness that moved, that pressed against her face and crawled up her sleeves, a darkness that had weight and teeth. She shifted Rosie higher on her shoulder. The baby had stopped making noise about an hour back. That scared Tessa more than anything else. Not the cold, not the dark, not the fact that she had no idea where they were or how far they'd walked. The silence from Rosie's small bundled body, pressed against her chest, was the thing that kept pushing her forward when every muscle she had was screaming at her to stop and sit down. Tessa. That was May, 8 years old, tugging at the back of Tessa's coat. I can't feel my toes. Keep walking, but I can't feel... I know. Tessa didn't turn around. Keep walking anyway. She could hear Danny sniffling behind May, and behind him, 9-year-old Cal, who hadn't said a single word in over an hour, and whose silence was almost as frightening as Rosie's. Cal was the kind of kid who always had something to say, always had a question or a complaint or some half-formed theory about why the sky was blue or what horses dreamed about. His silence meant he was scared past the point of talking, and Tessa understood that because she was there herself. She tried not to think about her mother. The shoes in the snow. That was the image that kept coming back to her. Both of her mother's shoes, set neatly side by side in the snow, maybe 50 yards from where they'd made camp. Clara Calloway's shoes. She'd gone out to check on the horses, that's what she'd said. Just going to check on the horses, I'll be right back. And then an hour passed, and then 2. And when Tessa finally went looking, she found the shoes. Not her mother, just the shoes. She didn't understand it. She still didn't understand it, and the not understanding sat inside her chest like a stone. Her mother did not take her shoes off in the snow. Her mother was not the kind of woman who did things like that. Her mother was the kind of woman who kept moving, who kept everyone fed, who could make something out of nothing and smile while she did it. And whatever had happened out there in the dark had been bad enough that Clara Calloway's shoes were sitting in the snow and Clara Calloway was gone. Tessa had woken the others and told them they had to walk. She didn't tell them about the shoes. That had been, she didn't know how long ago. 3 hours, maybe 4. Long enough for the blizzard to find its second wind and start howling again. Long enough for the fire they'd left behind to mean nothing. The camp was gone. The horses were gone, which meant their food and their blankets and their mother's rifle were gone. All they had was what they'd been wearing when they left, plus the 2 extra coats Tessa had thought to grab, which she'd wrestled onto Danny and May while Cal watched with wide eyes. She had Rosie, wrapped in the wool shawl their mother kept tied to her trunk. She had her own 2 legs. She had the distant, faint, barely there orange glow she'd spotted maybe 10 minutes ago, off to the northeast, low to the horizon, visible only in the gaps between gusts. Light meant a building. A building meant fire. Fire meant they might not die tonight. I see something, she said. Not loud. She didn't have the breath to spare. Just enough for the others to hear. What? May pressed closer. A light. Up ahead. She paused. Keep walking. Gideon Hale had not expected company. He hadn't expected much of anything, which was more or less the point. He'd built the ranch at the edge of Coldwater Canyon specifically because no one came out that far, specifically because the trail to his gate was unmarked, and the nearest town was 17 miles south through mountain terrain that discouraged casual travelers even in good weather. In a blizzard like this one, the trail was essentially a wall, which was why, when his dog started barking at 9:30, he didn't reach for his coat. He reached for his rifle. He stood at the window and looked out into the dark and the white, and for a long moment he didn't see anything. Just the snow coming sideways, just the yellow circle of light cast by the lamp he kept in the window. He'd started keeping it there 2 winters ago without ever really deciding to. Something about a dark window in a blizzard felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. His wife Elaine used to say a lit window was a promise. He wasn't sure he believed in promises anymore, but the lamp stayed. Then the shape appeared at the edge of the lamplight. Small, staggering. Then another shape, and another, and then he was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the first shape was carrying something, holding it against its chest, and his brain needed a full 3 seconds to process what his eyes were seeing because it was the last thing he'd expected. Children. He was out the door before he'd consciously decided to move. The cold hit him like a wall the moment he stepped off the porch, but he barely registered it. He pushed through the drifts to the edge of the lamplight, and he saw her. The oldest, the one in front, the one carrying the bundle. She was maybe 12, dark hair plastered to her face with ice and melted snow, coat soaked through, eyes fixed on the house with an expression he'd never forget. Not hope, exactly. Past hope. The look of someone who'd burned through hope a long time ago and was now running on something else entirely, some bone-deep stubbornness that refused to lie down. She stopped when she saw him, swayed, didn't fall. "Please," she said, and her voice came out cracked and thin, barely audible over the wind. "My sister, she stopped crying a while ago. Please, I need to... Give her to me." He reached for the bundle without thinking about it, and the girl, to her credit, and also to his something, handed the baby over without hesitation. Trusted him with the smallest one she had before she'd even seen his face clearly. He tucked the infant against his chest and turned back to the house. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then walk. All of you. Come on." He didn't wait to see if they followed. He trusted that they would, because the alternative was unthinkable, and he moved back toward the house as fast as he could through the drifts, unwrapping the top of the bundle enough to put his hand against the baby's face. Cold. Too cold. But when he pressed 2 fingers against her neck, he found a pulse. Faint, but there. Alive. Barely. The porch steps, the door. Heat, immediate and physical, like walking through a curtain. He put the baby on the table and started unwrapping her. Behind him, he heard the door bang open and 4 sets of feet stumble through it. The girl's name was Tessa. She told him that first before she told him anything else, like her name was the one thing she was absolutely sure of. She also told him, in a flat and exhausted voice that had clearly made peace with the facts, that her mother was missing. "Missing," Gideon repeated. He was filling a pot with water to heat on the stove, keeping one eye on the baby he'd laid near the fire, wrapped now in the dry blanket he'd grabbed from the cedar chest. The infant was making small sounds again. Not crying, just the soft animal sounds of a creature that was very cold and very unhappy, which under the circumstances he considered a good sign. "We made camp about, 4 miles back maybe." Tessa sat at his table with her hands wrapped around a mug of hot water because it was the fastest thing he could give her. The smaller ones were huddled near the fire, 2 girls and a boy, the boy the youngest and the most frightened, pressed against the oldest girl with his face half buried in her coat. She went to check on the horses. That was before dark. She didn't come back. "You looked for her." It wasn't a question, but she answered it like one. "I found her shoes. In the snow. Both of them." She paused. "She didn't take them off. That's not... She wouldn't do that." Gideon set the pot on the stove. "No," he said, "she wouldn't." He said it because it was true, and because she needed someone to confirm that what she knew was real. Clara Calloway, he didn't have a name yet, but a woman traveling in that kind of weather with 5 children, one of them an infant, was not a woman who stopped to take her shoes off and wander away from her camp. Something had happened. Something had been done. "How long ago?" he asked. It was before dark, maybe 5 hours, 6? He turned that over. 6 hours, in a blizzard, barefoot, whatever had happened to her. The numbers were not good. The numbers were, in fact, very bad, and he stood there at his stove and thought about them and then deliberately set them aside because the children needed him present and warm and not doing math about survival odds. "What's your name?" he asked the boy by the fire. The boy looked up, red nose, red eyes, lower lip still trembling. "Danny. Danny, are your feet hurting?" The boy thought about it. "Yeah." "That's good. That means you've still got feeling in them." He pulled the second chair away from the table and set it closer to the fire. Come sit here, both of you. May and Cal, right? The girl looked up, startled that he knew her name. Tessa must have told him, or maybe he'd picked it up from the way she'd spoken to them on the porch. She'd heard him saying their names, organizing them, getting them inside. Yeah, sit close to the fire. Not too close. I'm going to get dry clothes. He didn't have children's clothes. He had his own shirts and trousers, which were far too big, but they were dry and warm, and he pulled the smallest things he owned from the chest in the bedroom and brought them back and handed them over without ceremony. Tessa took them without a word and started organizing her siblings with a quiet efficiency that made something ache in his chest. She'd done this before, not this exactly, not tonight, but the organizing, the managing, the keeping of everyone together. She'd been doing it for a while. He went back to the stove. He made soup from what he had. Dried beans he'd soaked that morning, salt pork, a few withered carrots from the root cellar, an onion. Not much, but warm and thick. He boiled it until the beans were soft and ladled it into every bowl he owned. And when he turned back to the room, the two younger ones were already half asleep against each other near the fire, wearing his shirts like dresses. And Tessa was sitting at the table again with the baby in her arms, looking down at Rosie with an expression so tired and so fierce and so young that he had to look away for a second. She's okay? He asked. She's breathing regular now. Tessa didn't look up. She's warming up. Good. He set a bowl in front of her. Eat something. In a minute. Now. You can hold her and eat at the same time. She looked up at him then, and he saw the calculation happen behind her eyes, checking him, reading him, deciding whether he was someone who could be trusted with a directive like that, or whether he was just another adult telling her what to do for no reason. Then she picked up the spoon and ate. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. What's up? He didn't sleep that night. He got the children settled, the three older ones in his bedroom with the door cracked so the heat got through. Rosie in the drawer he'd lined with a folded blanket because he didn't have a cradle and the drawer was the right size. He sat at the table with a cup of cold coffee and listened to the blizzard work itself out. And he thought about a woman's shoes left in the snow 6 hours back. He thought about the kinds of things that happened in Coldwater Canyon in winter, when the trails were empty and the settlers were isolated and there was no one around to see. He'd heard talk in town about travelers going missing along the mountain route. Sheriff Burrell had chalked it up to the weather, to bad decisions, to the natural attrition of frontier life. Gideon had his own thoughts, which he'd kept to himself because it wasn't his business, and he'd made a deliberate choice to stay out of other people's business. He looked at the drawer where the baby was sleeping. He thought about the shoes. He got up and went to the window and looked out at the dark. The snow was easing off now. He could see stars in a few gaps between the clouds, the mountain peaks turning silver at the ridgeline. Another 2-3 hours, and it would be clear enough to ride. He went to the stable and checked his horse. He went back inside and sat down again. At some point, without really deciding to, he started gathering what he'd need. Tessa woke at first light to the smell of wood smoke and something frying. For one disoriented second, she didn't know where she was, and then the night came back to her in pieces. The snow, the walking, the light in the distance, the man with the rifle who had come out to meet them and taken Rosie without flinching. She lay still for a moment, cataloging. May breathing softly beside her, Cal's arm thrown over his face. Danny curled into a ball near the wall, smaller than he usually looked. All here, all breathing. She got up carefully and went into the main room. The rancher, she'd learned his name was Gideon, was at the stove. He'd made eggs from somewhere and was frying them in a pan, and beside the stove there was a pack on the table packed tight, with a bedroll strapped to the top. His rifle was leaning against the wall next to it. He had his coat on. Tessa stood in the doorway and looked at the pack and looked at him and felt something shift in her stomach. You're leaving, she said. He didn't turn around. Going to look for your mother. She'd expected it, but hearing it said out loud still hit her somewhere between the ribs. She stood there and breathed through it. You don't know where she is. You told me where you made camp, 4 miles east near the Red Rock Formation. That's Coldwater Gulch. He flipped the eggs. I know that area. The Sheriff Burrell is 17 miles away in town. He said it without particular inflection, just stating a fact. By the time anyone got a message to him and he rode out here, it'd be 48 hours. Maybe more if the trail's bad. He paused. How old's the baby? 3 months? Your mother nursing her? The question was blunt, but she understood why he was asking. Yes. He turned around then, and she got a proper look at him for the first time in daylight. He was older than she'd thought, 40, maybe more, with a weathered face and gray threading through dark hair and eyes that were the kind of tired that didn't go away with sleep. He wasn't a big man, particularly, but he had the kind of stillness that made him seem bigger than he was. I'm not going to tell you she's fine, he said. I don't know that, but I know the country, and I know the people who work that canyon, and I'm going back there. He looked at her steadily. You and your sisters and brothers stay here. The food's in the pantry, the wood's stacked on the porch. I'll be back before dark. Tessa crossed her arms. What if you're not? Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but close to it. The way a man almost laughs at something that isn't actually funny. Then you wait until morning and send your brother to town. Tell him to ask for Sheriff Burrell and tell him everything you told me. He turned back to the stove. But I'll be back. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother's shoes, set neatly side by side in the snow, and about the way her mother used to say that you could tell a lot about a person by what they did when no one was watching. She thought about this man, who had no reason in the world to come out into a blizzard for a child he'd never met, and who was now eating standing up so he could get on his horse faster. Thank you, she said. He waved a hand without turning around, like the words embarrassed him. Eat something, he said. There's eggs on the stove. The trail back to Coldwater Gulch took Gideon 2 hours in the aftermath of the blizzard, and he spent most of it trying not to think about what he was walking back into. He'd spent 6 years walking away from exactly this kind of thing. 6 years of deliberate quiet, deliberate distance, building his ranch up from nothing in a place far enough from everything that nothing could find him. That had been the deal he'd made with himself after everything that happened. After Eleanor and the boy, after the grief that had taken 3 years to settle from acute to chronic, he'd decided the world could do what it wanted with itself. He was done. He looked down at the trail and followed the traces the children had left. The stumbling, irregular track of 4 sets of small boots through the snow, one pair deeper than the rest where Tessa had been carrying extra weight. They'd come a long way in the dark, longer than he'd expected. He urged his horse forward. He found the camp in a hollow between 2 red rock formations, just where Tessa had described. The fire had been out for hours, buried under new snow. The horses were gone. All that remained were the cut ends of their lead ropes, which told him something. Not spooked and run. Taken. Cut loose and led away, or more likely stolen after whoever had been here ran off the horses to keep Clara from following. He dismounted and walked the perimeter. There. Just at the edge of the hollow, where the ground sloped down into the gulch. The shoes. He crouched beside them and looked at them for a long moment without touching them. Clara Calloway's shoes, left neatly upright in the snow, heels together, like someone had set them there. Not like they'd fallen off, not like they'd been kicked free in a struggle. Placed. That was deliberate. That was a message, or a mockery, or both. He stood up and looked down into the gulch. The snow down there was churned up. He could see where something, several somethings, horses most likely, had come up out of the gulch and crossed the hollow and then gone back down the other side. He could see where a person had been dragged. The marks were faint under the fresh snow, but they were there. He knew this gulch. He knew what happened in it. He'd known for a long time. He'd chosen not to care. He stood there in the cold and looked at the drag marks in the snow and the shoes sitting neatly at the edge of the hollow. And he made a different choice. The trail into Coldwater Canyon proper was steep and narrow, cut into the canyon wall by 100 years of foot traffic and animal paths. In summer, it was manageable. After a blizzard, it was close to suicidal, which meant no one would be looking for anyone down there, which was probably the point. His horse balked twice on the way down. He couldn't blame her. He coaxed her through it and kept moving, and when the canyon opened up around him, walls of red and gray rock, the frozen creek bed at the bottom, the shadows deep even in daylight. He pulled up and listened. Wind. The creak of ice somewhere upstream, his horses breathing, and then, faintly, voices. He dismounted and tied the horse to a scrub pine and moved forward on foot, keeping to the shadow of the canyon wall. He moved slowly, which cost him, because moving slowly in that cold meant feeling every degree of it. But he'd learned a long time ago that the cost of moving fast when you didn't know what was ahead was generally higher. He smelled smoke before he saw the fire. It was a camp, not a proper camp, nothing built for comfort, but a functional one. A fire against the canyon wall with a crude windbreak of pine branches on 3 sides. He counted 3 men from his position, 2 at the fire, 1 sitting apart on a rock, and the third, no, he'd miscounted. 4. The fourth was standing near a tethered line of horses, talking in a low voice to someone he couldn't see clearly. He shifted his angle. He saw her. Clara Calloway, he assumed on context, was sitting against the canyon wall with her wrists tied in front of her and a blanket thrown over her shoulders that didn't seem to be doing much. Even from this distance, he could see she was shivering. Her feet were bare. She was alive clearly because she was arguing with the man standing next to her, though he was too far back to hear the words. He could only see her face, the way her chin was lifted even while she shook, the set of her jaw. Same jaw as her daughter. 4 men. He had 1 rifle, 1 revolver, and the element of surprise, which was something. He stayed in the shadow and thought it through. Shooting it out with 4 men in a narrow canyon was not a plan with a lot of good outcomes, for him or for the woman currently using one of them as a verbal target. If he missed, or if the first shot didn't put someone down cleanly, it became close quarters fighting against multiple opponents, and the woman was in the middle of it. But if he waited, they were going to move her. He could see they were packing up. The 2 men at the fire were rolling blankets. The horses were already saddled and loaded. He didn't have the time to do this carefully. He thought, very briefly, about the girl back at his ranch, the way she'd looked at him across the breakfast table, arms crossed, eyes direct. What if you're not? He backed up, circled around, and found a better position. Quote. The first shot he fired was deliberate and placed the rope that held the horses to the tethering line. It parted cleanly, and 6 horses immediately did what panicked horses do in a confined space, which was scatter in all directions at high speed, taking most of the available confusion with them. "The canyon!" he heard someone shout. "Up on the—" He was already moving. What followed was chaotic in the way that any real fight is chaotic, which is to say nothing like the clean, deliberate stories people tell about it afterward. He came down the canyon wall faster than was wise, slipped on a patch of ice, caught himself against a rock, kept going. One of the men took a shot at him that hit the rock face 3 feet to his left and sent chips flying. He put that man down with a shot to the shoulder, not where he'd aimed, but close enough, and kept his feet moving. 2 of the remaining men ran for the horses they could catch. One stood his ground. That one was bigger than the others, heavy set, with a beard that had ice in it and eyes that were doing that flat, dangerous calculation Gideon recognized from men who'd done this kind of thing before. He had a shotgun and he swung it up as Gideon cleared the last stretch of open ground between them. Gideon dropped. The shot went over him and he came up inside the man's reach before he could break the shotgun to reload, got his hand on the barrel, and what happened next was fast and ugly and not something he'd describe in polite company afterward. When it was over, he was standing and the man with the shotgun was not. He stood there for a second, breathing. The 2 who'd run were gone, somewhere in the canyon with the horses, putting distance between themselves and the situation as fast as possible. The one he'd shot in the shoulder was sitting in the snow making sounds. 3 accounted for. He turned. The 4th man, the one who'd been talking to Clara, was standing at the canyon wall with Clara between himself and Gideon, his arm around her throat, a knife in his other hand. "Back off," he said. His voice was steady, which told Gideon he was either very experienced or very scared. "Back off, or I'll—" "You'll what?" Gideon said it flat. Not a question. He kept his voice even and kept walking, slow, steady, like someone crossing a field rather than walking toward a knife. "You're alone. Your men are gone. The horses are gone. You've got nowhere to go in this canyon that I can't follow." "I said back off." "I heard you." He stopped about 15 feet away, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to not be stupid. He looked at the man's eyes, not the knife. "Here's the situation. You let her go, I let you walk out of this canyon. You can say you ran into trouble, got separated from the others, Whatever story you want. I don't care. He paused. Or you hold on to her, and we find out together how this ends. But I'll tell you right now. There's only one way it ends for you if you hurt her. Silence. Clara, to her credit, was perfectly still. He could see her looking at him over the man's arm, that same direct evaluating look he'd seen on her daughter's face, figuring him out, deciding whether to trust him. He met her eyes. She drove her heel down hard onto the man's instep. The grip loosened. Not much, but enough. And Gideon covered the 15 feet between them in the time it took the man to yelp and adjust, and then the knife was on the ground, and the man was on the ground, and the situation was resolved in a manner that was less clean than he would have preferred. He looked down at his hands. His knuckles were bleeding. "Are you hurt?" he asked, without looking up. Clara Calloway, barefoot in the snow, wrists still bound, said, "I've been better." He almost laughed. He didn't, because it didn't seem like the right time. He pulled his knife from his belt and cut the rope from her wrists and straightened up and looked at her. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe, with dark eyes and the same quality of exhausted stubbornness he'd already seen once tonight. "Your children are at my ranch," he said. "All of them. The baby's okay." Something went through her face then. He only caught the edge of it before she got it under control, but it hit him somewhere in the chest. The particular relief of a mother hearing that her children are alive, the kind of relief that breaks through everything else. "Rosie," she said, and her voice came out unsteady for the first time. "She's fine, breathing fine, warming up. Your oldest—" He stopped. "Tessa. Tessa got them all there, 2 hours in that blizzard. She didn't lose a single one of them." Clara stood there for a second, barefoot in the snow, in a canyon, after everything. And she pressed her fingers against her mouth and stood very still, and he looked away and gave her that moment because it wasn't his to watch. "We need to go," he said, when enough time had passed. "Yes." Her voice was steady again. "I know." He got her onto his horse and led it back through the canyon and up the trail, which was every bit as miserable on the return as it had been going down. She didn't complain. She sat in the saddle. He walked, because the horse could carry one of them, and she was barefoot, with her jaw set and her eyes on the trail ahead. And she didn't say much, but what she said mattered. "How did they find you?" he asked, partway up the trail. "I think they were watching the camp." Her voice was measured, like she was pulling the facts out carefully. "When I went out to check on the horses, 2 of them came out of the trees. They had the camp surrounded before I could get back." She paused. "They took my shoes on purpose, so I couldn't run." He thought about the shoes set neatly side by side in the snow. The message in that. "They weren't just waiting for you specifically," he said. "They work that trail. Anyone coming through. I figured that out." She looked down at him from the horse. "You knew about them." It wasn't accusatory, just stating it. He was quiet for a moment. The trail was steep here and the footing was uncertain, and he focused on that for a few steps before answering. "I'd heard things. But you stayed out of it." "Yes." Another pause. "And now?" she asked. He thought about the camp, the tethering line, the 4 men, 2 run, 1 sitting in the snow with a shoulder wound, 1 not going anywhere under his own power. He thought about the trail they used, the operation they'd built in that gulch, the travelers who'd passed through and never arrived where they were going. "I'm not going to stay out of it anymore," he said. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. And they came up out of the canyon into the afternoon light and turned north toward the ranch. And somewhere ahead of them, 17 miles of trail, a sheriff was going to get the worst morning of his career. Tessa was waiting on the porch when they came over the ridge. Gideon saw her from 100 yards out, standing in the cold without her coat because she'd probably left it inside for one of the others, arms wrapped around herself, watching the tree line. When she saw the horse, when she saw the figure in the saddle, she went absolutely still for 1 second. Then she was off the porch and running through the snow. Clara slid down from the horse before Gideon even got to the gate, and then Tessa hit her at full speed and they went down together in the snow. Clara catching her, both of them going to their knees, Tessa's face buried in her mother's shoulder. He heard the sound she made, and he looked away. He took his horse to the stable and unbridled her and got her some water and hay, and took longer about it than was strictly necessary. When he came back around to the front of the house, the whole family was on the porch. May and Cal and Danny pressed against their mother, and Clara sitting on the top step with her arms around as many of them as she could reach. Rosie was back inside, he assumed, in the drawer by the fire. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "I told you before dark," he said. Tessa looked up from her mother's shoulder. Her face was wet, which she clearly felt some kind of way about. "You cut it close. Trail was bad." He went past them into the house. He put a pot of water on and started thinking about what he had in the pantry that could feed 6 people for dinner. Because that was the immediate problem, and the immediate problem was what he had. He could hear them outside on the porch, low voices, the sounds of children pressing questions at their mother, Clara answering in a tone that was warm and even, and clearly managing how much truth she was letting through. He could hear Tessa's voice, quieter than the others, asking different questions. He stood at his stove and listened to the sounds of a family putting itself back together. It had been a long time since his house had sounded like that. He wasn't sure what to do with the feeling that came with it. He'd spent 6 years making sure he didn't have to figure that out. But the feeling was there anyway, quiet and stubborn, like a fire someone else had started in a room he'd kept dark. He put the pot on the heat and started dinner. Outside, through the window, the last light was dying over the canyon walls, and the snow that had buried everything the night before was already beginning to crust over, turning hard and luminous in the cold. Tomorrow it would be bright enough to blind you, but tonight it was just quiet. He stirred the pot and didn't think about tomorrow yet. Clara didn't sleep that first night. She lay in Gideon's bedroom with Rosie tucked against her side and listened to her children breathe. May's slow, deep rhythm, Cal shifting once and going still. Danny curled against the wall like he always slept, knees pulled up, one fist under his chin. Tessa was the last one to settle. She lay on her back for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and Clara watched the side of her face in the dark and thought about all the things she'd have to say to her daughter eventually, all the words she owed her, and how none of them felt close to enough. 12 years old. She'd carried her infant sister 2 hours through a blizzard and hadn't lost anyone. Clara closed her eyes and breathed through it. In the main room, she could hear Gideon moving, quiet, unhurried, the sounds of a man who was used to being the only one awake, the scrape of a chair, the soft pop of the stove. She'd tried to thank him properly before he'd sent them all to bed, and he'd looked at her with that particular expression she was already starting to recognize, the one that meant he found gratitude uncomfortable and would prefer to change the subject. She hadn't pushed it. She was too tired to push anything. But she lay there in the dark and thought about the canyon and the men and the way he'd walked toward the knife like he was crossing a field. And she thought about the fact that none of this was over. The men who'd taken her were part of something bigger. She knew that because she'd listened while she sat against that canyon wall with her wrists bound, and she had a good ear for detail even when she was frightened, especially when she was frightened. She'd heard names, routes. She'd heard enough to know that what happened to her in Coldwater Canyon was not a random act of opportunistic violence. And she'd heard Warren's name, not spoken directly, not with any clarity she could swear to, but it was there, in the gaps between the things the men said when they thought she wasn't paying attention. A name, a connection, a piece she hadn't wanted to fit into place, but that fit anyway, clicking into position like a stone finding the bottom of a well. She pressed her face against the top of Rosie's head and felt the baby stir and resettle. Warren Cross. Her late husband's brother. The man she'd been running from for 4 months, across 2 territories, with 5 children and everything she could load onto a wagon. The man who'd decided, when Daniel died, that everything Daniel had owned, the land, the livestock, and his wife, passed to the family in some order that Clara had never agreed to, and that no law she knew of supported, but that Warren had decided was simply the way things were. She'd filed papers before she left. She'd been careful. She had the deed to the land in Daniel's name and hers jointly, and she had a lawyer in Millhaven who'd assured her that Warren had no legal claim to anything. Warren didn't care about legal claims. Warren cared about what he believed was his, and she'd heard his name in that canyon, in the mouth of a man who tied women's wrists and stole their shoes. Outside the window, the snow had stopped. The stars were out. She could see one corner of the sky from where she lay, black and very clear, the kind of clear that comes after a storm has pushed everything else out of the way. She looked at it for a while and thought about what morning would bring. At some point, without meaning to, she slept. She found Gideon on the porch before sunrise. He was sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark in the direction of the canyon. He heard her come out and move slightly to make room, not saying anything, which she appreciated. She sat down and wrapped her borrowed coat tighter and looked at the same direction he was looking. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Not much." "Me either." She folded her hands around her own cup. He'd had coffee on the stove when she came in, which meant he'd made it knowing she'd be up, or knowing someone would. "I need to tell you something." "I figured." She turned to look at him. He was watching the tree line, not her, which made it easier somehow. "The men in that canyon, they weren't just waiting on the trail." "No," he said. "They weren't. Someone sent them." She paused. "Or someone has an arrangement with them. I'm not certain which." He turned his head then. In the gray pre-dawn light, his face was harder to read than in lamplight. "You know who?" It wasn't quite a question. She'd noticed he did that, phrased things as statements when he already had an idea of the answer, giving her room to confirm or correct rather than just asking directly. She wasn't sure if it was courtesy or habit, but either way, she didn't mind it. "My husband's brother," she said. "Warren Cross." She said the name deliberately, the way you say something out loud to stop it from having power over you, though she wasn't sure it worked. "Daniel, my husband, he died 8 months ago. Fever. It was fast." She stopped because the sequence of events didn't need much embellishment. Warren decided afterward that the land should go to him. He made that very clear. When I wouldn't agree, he started making things difficult. Then more than difficult. "Did he threaten you directly?" "Not in words. Warren doesn't... He's careful. He doesn't say things you can point to." She looked down at the cup in her hands. "He just shows up, lets you know he's there, takes things. One of our horses turned up dead in the field, and there was no reason for it. No illness, no injury anyone could find. He did that. I know he did it, but I can't prove it." She paused. "He showed up at the house one night and stood in the yard and didn't come to the door. Just stood there for 2 hours. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "So you ran?" "I left," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and didn't apologize for it. "There's a difference. I filed the right papers, and I made the right arrangements, and I left with my children and the deed to my land, and I was going to Harlan County where my cousin lives and where Warren doesn't have any friends." She looked at the tree line. "I didn't know about the canyon. I didn't know what was in it." "Most people don't." "But you did." She said it the same way he'd said things to her. Not accusatory, just placing it between them so they could both look at it. "You said you'd heard things." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I heard things about the canyon 2 years back. Travelers going missing on the mountain route. Stock animals turning up without their owners. I went to Sheriff Burrell." He stopped. "And?" "He said it was the weather. Said people make bad decisions in bad conditions, and sometimes they don't come out the other side." He turned the cup in his hands. He wasn't interested in hearing a different theory. "But you had one." "I had one. I didn't push it." He looked out at the dawn coming up behind the peaks, the sky going from black to the deep blue that comes just before color. "I decided I was done pushing things, done getting into business that wasn't mine." He paused, and something shifted in his expression briefly. "That worked out well." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You pulled 2 men out of that canyon," she said. "Stopped whatever they would have done to me. Brought 5 children in from a blizzard. That seems like a man who isn't as done as he thinks." He didn't say anything to that. She turned back to the horizon. "Warren will find out what happened down there. The 2 who ran will tell him, or word will get back somehow. He'll know someone interfered." She set her cup down on the step beside her. "He'll come." "I know." She looked at him again. "That doesn't concern you?" "It concerns me." He stood up, picking up his cup. "But being concerned doesn't change what needs to be done." He went back inside, and after a moment, she followed him. "What?" The next 3 days were strange in the way that aftermath is always strange. The quiet after a storm that still has the smell of lightning in it. The calm that doesn't feel entirely real because your body hasn't stopped bracing yet. Clara and the children stayed. It wasn't a decision that got discussed formally so much as a situation that settled itself by degrees. The storm had made the trail to town impassable for the first day, and when it cleared, Rosie came down with a cough that Clara wouldn't risk exposing to a 17-mile winter ride. And by the time the baby was better, there was another 3 inches of snow on the ground, and the trail was bad again. These were the practical reasons. Clara understood them, and she also understood that she was grateful for them, because she needed time to think, and the ranch gave her time and space in a way that the road had not. Gideon was... She wasn't sure how to characterize it. Not warm, exactly. Warmth implied something open and easy, and he was neither of those things. But he was decent in a way that went beyond courtesy, attentive in a quiet way that didn't call attention to itself. He fixed the cot in the corner of the main room without being asked, because Tessa had been sleeping on a folded blanket. He brought extra firewood inside when the temperature dropped. He showed Cal how to feed the horses without making a production of it, just handed him the hay and demonstrated and stepped back. And Clara watched her son's face while he worked beside the man, and saw something she hadn't seen there in a while. The children were... She kept coming back to the word careful. They moved through his space carefully, as if they were aware of how much they were taking up and were trying to take up less. May helped with dishes without being asked. Danny stayed close to Tessa or Clara and didn't get into things. Even Cal, who was constitutionally incapable of silence, kept his questions short and didn't push when Gideon gave him a short answer. On the second evening, she found Tessa sitting at the table after the others had gone to bed, with the deed to the land spread out in front of her. Clara stopped in the doorway. "Where did you get that?" "From the trunk. I knew where you kept it." Tessa looked up, not defensive, just straightforward. "Is it real? What the lawyer told you, is it real? Does Warren actually not have a claim?" Clara came and sat across from her. She looked at the paper, Daniel's handwriting on the deed and hers, and the county clerk's stamp, and thought about how to answer honestly. "The lawyer said the deed is valid. My name is on it. Daniel put both our names on it when we married, which means it transfers to me, not to his family." She folded her hands on the table. "That's what the law says." "But Warren doesn't care what the law says. Warren cares what he can make happen." She looked at her daughter. "Those aren't the same thing. But the gap between them is where we have to live, and that gap is... It's not nothing. There are things we can do within it." Tessa was quiet for a moment, looking at the deed. "He sent those men, didn't he, in the canyon?" Clara had been thinking about how to handle this, how much to tell her, and she'd come to the conclusion that Tessa had earned the truth. She'd already proven she could carry more than anyone her age should have to. "I think so. I can't prove it yet, but I think he was the one who told them we were on that trail." Tessa took a slow breath. "So he knows where we are?" "He will, if he doesn't already." "And what do we do?" Clara looked at her daughter's face, the same dark eyes, the same jaw she saw in her own mirror, the expression of someone who was tired of being surprised by bad things and had decided to start planning instead. "I go to town," she said. "I talk to the sheriff. I tell him what happened in the canyon, all of it. And I make sure there's a record of it. That's the first thing." She paused. "A record matters. It's harder to make people disappear when there's a record." "And after that?" "We figure out after that when we get there." Tessa looked at her for a moment. Then she folded the deed carefully and slid it back across the table. "Okay," she said, like she'd made a decision she could live with. "Okay?" Gideon heard most of that conversation. He wasn't trying to. The ranch was not large and the walls were thin, and he'd come back inside for a cup of water and stopped in the dark hallway when he heard their voices and understood what they were talking about. He stood there for a while after they'd gone quiet, in the dark, with his cup. Then he went to bed. In the morning, he told Clara he'd take her to town. She looked at him across the breakfast table. The whole family around it, which was still strange, the sounds of that many people in a space built for one, and she said, "You don't have to do that." "I know. We can manage the trail on our own once the snow's clear enough today." He looked at her steadily. "And I need to talk to Burl myself." She read something in his face that made her stop arguing. "All right," she said. "This afternoon?" "This morning. Earlier, the better." The ride to Ridgeline took 2.5 hours, which was faster than Clara had expected given the conditions. Gideon knew the trail in a way that went beyond familiarity. He knew where the drifts hid the ruts, where the ground was soft under the crust, where the shortcut through the pine grove saved a quarter-mile. He moved through that terrain like a man who had memorized it in the dark, and she supposed he had. They left the children with, she hadn't expected this, and neither had the children, a neighbor. A woman named Ruth Alderman who lived on the next ranch over 3 miles east, who apparently had a standing arrangement with Gideon to check on his livestock when he was away. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 50 or so who looked at the children arrayed on the porch with the expression of someone making a rapid inventory and said, "I'll put them to work," without any further preamble. Danny had looked alarmed. Tessa had looked, for the first time in days, almost relieved. Clara and Gideon rode to town. She used the riding time to think through what she was going to say to the sheriff, arranging it in her head the way her father had taught her to arrange an argument. Facts first, then sequence, then the conclusion you want the listener to arrive at before you ask them to arrive there. She was good at this when she was calm. She was less good at it when she was frightened, which was why she spent the whole 2.5 hours working to be calm first. Gideon didn't try to make conversation, which she appreciated. He seemed to understand that she needed the silence and gave it to her without making it pointed. Ridgeline was not much of a town. A main street with a dozen buildings, a livery at one end and a church at the other, a general store, a telegraph office, and the sheriff's office wedged between the assay office and what appeared to have once been a hotel and was now something more ambiguous. It was the kind of town that looked like it was deciding whether to grow or give up and hadn't made its mind up yet. Gideon tied the horses at the post in front of the sheriff's office. "Let me go first," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "I know Burl. He tends to dig in if he feels like he's being told what to do. If I talk to him first, set the context, he's more likely to listen when you come in." He paused. "That's not a comment on you. That's a comment on him." She thought about it. She didn't love it, but she understood the logic of it. "5 minutes," she said. "Then I'm coming in." "That's fine." Sheriff Augustin Burl was a man who had clearly been told he was capable for a long time and had not been significantly tested on the matter. He was maybe 55, well-fed, with a face that had settled into the expression of a man who had heard most things before and found them tedious. He was sitting at his desk when Gideon came in, working through a plate of something that smelled like it might have been stew once. He looked up. He didn't look particularly pleased. "Hail," he said. "It's been a while." 4 years, Gideon said, which was accurate. He took the chair across from the desk without being invited. "I need to talk to you about Coldwater Canyon." Something moved in Burl's face, too fast to read clearly, but it was there. He set down his fork. "Canyon. 3 days ago. I rode down there and found a woman taken off the mountain trail and being held by 4 men in a camp against the canyon wall." He kept his voice even. "Her children were at my place. She'd been grabbed the night before." "You rode down into the canyon," Burl said slowly, "by yourself." "Yes." "And there were 4 men." "Yes." Burl leaned back in his chair and looked at him the way a man looks at something he's going to have to deal with but would prefer not to. "And these 4 men, where are they now?" 2 ran. 1 took a shoulder wound and is probably in the canyon still, or was when I left. The other, he paused. "The other is also in the canyon." Burl was quiet for a moment. "The other one." He had a knife on the woman. Another pause. Burl picked up his fork and then set it back down. "Gideon, you understand what you're telling me here." "I understand exactly what I'm telling you. I need you to understand it too." He leaned forward slightly. "That canyon is being used as a hunting ground. Travelers on the mountain route, people coming through in bad weather, isolated, vulnerable, are being targeted. This has been happening for a while. I told you about it 2 years ago. You told me you'd heard some talk. I'm telling you now that I've seen it myself. And I'm telling you that the woman who was taken didn't end up in that canyon by accident. Someone told those men she was on that trail. Someone with a reason to want her stopped." He let that sit for a moment. "Her name is Clara Calloway. She's outside. You should hear from her directly." Burl looked at the door and then back at Gideon. "You're telling me someone hired them. I'm telling you that's worth finding out." The door opened and Clara came in, and Gideon stood and moved out of the way, because he'd used his 5 minutes and she'd earned her turn. She told it plainly. Clara Calloway was, Gideon observed, a woman who did not dress things up. She laid the facts down like someone laying cards on a table, one at a time, face up, not embellishing and not minimizing. The night she was taken, what she'd heard in the canyon, Warren Cross's name spoken in the dark by men who shouldn't have known it. The shoes. Burl wrote things down, which was something. He also asked questions that were not entirely helpful. Whether she was sure about the name, whether she might have misheard, whether she had any documentation to support her claim that Warren Cross had any interest in her land. She answered each one with the same measured patience, and only twice did Gideon see her jaw tighten in a way that suggested she was working hard to stay measured. When she finished, Burl put down his pen. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, in the tone of a man about to be reasonable in a way that isn't quite. "I hear what you're telling me. I do. But what I can act on, right, what I can take to a judge, is what happened in that canyon 3 days ago. And frankly, given that 2 of the men involved have scattered and one of the others is," he looked at Gideon briefly, "incapacitated. The case is thin." "There's a man with a shoulder wound in that canyon," Clara said. "He can be found. I'll send someone to look." He didn't sound like someone who was definitely going to send someone. He sounded like someone buying time. As for Warren Cross, without more than a name overheard in a stressful situation, I can't act on that. "But you can note it," Gideon said from the wall where he was standing. "Write it down. Today's date, this conversation, her name, his name. Put it in the record." Burl looked at him. "I know how to do my job, Gideon." "Then do it." The silence stretched between them, and it was not a comfortable one. Burl broke it first, picking up his pen and making an addition to what he'd written, and Gideon understood that they'd gotten what they were going to get today, which wasn't nothing but also wasn't enough. They left the sheriff's office and stood on the main street in the pale winter sunlight. Clara looked at the telegraph office across the street for a long moment. "I need to send a message to my lawyer in Mill Haven," she said. "Tell him what's happened. Tell him to file something. I don't know what, but something. So there's a paper trail." "That's a good idea." She crossed the street without waiting, and he followed. They were in the telegraph office for 20 minutes. The man behind the counter was professionally incurious, which was a quality Gideon respected in telegraph operators. Clara dictated a message to a man named Harlan Voss, Esquire, in Mill Haven, and it was not a short message, and she paid for every word of it without hesitating. When they came back out, she stood for a moment on the sidewalk and seemed to arrive at some kind of decision. "I know you've done enough," she said. "More than enough. And I'm not asking for anything more than what you've already given." She turned to look at him directly. "But I need to ask what your situation is, with us being there." He took a moment. "My situation. We're on your land. Your ranch. I don't know what your plan was when you opened that door, but I didn't have a plan," he said. "I saw children in a blizzard and I opened the door. And now," he thought about that. He thought about Ruth Alderman putting his children to work without ceremony, and about the sounds of the house at night with people in it, and about the baby in the drawer by the fire making small sounds, and about Tessa sitting across the breakfast table with her jaw set and her eyes direct. He thought about the canyon and what was in it, and the fact that he'd known about it for 2 years and done nothing. "Stay until you're on your feet," he said, "until the road is clear and the baby's healthy enough and you've got somewhere solid to go." He paused. "I'm not putting you out in the cold." Clara looked at him for a moment. The winter light was flat and bright on the street, and it showed everything clearly, including whatever it was that moved through her expression before she got it under control. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than relief. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me," he said, and he walked back toward the horses. He heard her make a sound behind him that might have been a laugh, just barely. He kept walking. On the ride home, about a mile outside of town, she said, "He's going to come." Gideon didn't pretend to misunderstand her. "I know. Warren, when he finds out what happened in the canyon, when he knows we're alive and we've been to the sheriff," she kept her eyes on the trail, "he won't send other men next time. He'll come himself. Probably. And you're still saying stay." "I'm saying stay." He looked at her. "I spent 6 years keeping my head down and staying out of things that were happening on trails I could see from my window. That didn't make the things stop happening." He turned back to the trail. I'm done with that. She was quiet for a long moment. The trail curved upward here, into the pines, and the light changed, filtered, and blue-white. What happened? She asked. Not prying, just asking, in the tone of someone who understood there was something to ask about. He thought about it. He'd gotten used to not answering questions like that. The not answering had become so habitual, it took him a moment to figure out how to undo it. My wife, he said, and our son. Fever, same as your husband. It took them both inside of 2 weeks, 7 years ago. He kept his voice even. After that, I built the ranch and stopped paying attention to much else. She didn't say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. Sorry was a word people used when they didn't know what else to say, and she seemed to know that he didn't need it. It changes you, she said instead. Losing someone like that. Yes. Doesn't go away. No, just changes shape. Gets smaller some years. He looked at the peaks above the tree line. Some years it doesn't. She nodded, like that was the right answer, like she'd been carrying her own version of it long enough to recognize the description. They rode the rest of the way without talking, and it was the comfortable kind of silence that you don't get between strangers, which meant that somewhere between the blizzard and the canyon and the sheriff's office, they had stopped being that. Gideon wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. He was sure, by the time the ranch came into sight over the ridge, that the next thing coming wasn't over and wasn't going to be easy, and that he was going to see it through regardless. Warren Cross was going to come. He'd have to come through Gideon first. That was not nothing. Warren Cross arrived on a Thursday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. The sky was clear for the first time in 2 weeks, hard blue and cold, the kind of winter sky that makes everything look sharper than it actually is. Cal had been out since morning helping Gideon mend the fence line on the north pasture, and Danny had appointed himself the official carrier of tools, a job he took with the particular gravity of a 6-year-old who has been given real responsibility for the first time. Clara was inside with Rosie, the baby finally over her cough, and making up for lost time with a volume and persistence that had everyone in the house learning to talk over her. May had decided to teach herself to braid rope from a coil she'd found in the stable, and had made something that wasn't quite rope and wasn't quite anything else, and was very proud of it. It was, in other words, the closest thing to ordinary that they'd had since the blizzard. Tessa saw him first. She was coming around the corner of the barn with a bucket of water for the horses when the riders came over the ridge. 3 of them, picking their way down the slope at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, the kind of pace that says, I'm not rushing because I don't need to. She stopped walking and watched them, and she didn't know who they were, not yet. But something in her went still and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. She set the bucket down quietly. She went inside. Mama. She didn't raise her voice. Clara looked up from the table where she was bouncing Rosie against her shoulder. One look at Tessa's face and she was on her feet. How many? 3. Coming down the north ridge. Clara's jaw went tight. She crossed to the window and looked, and whatever she saw in the lead rider's posture, his size, the way he sat the horse like a man who owned the ground under it, she stepped back from the window, and her face did something complicated and quick that she smoothed out before she turned around. Get your brothers and sister, she said. All of you stay inside. Lock the back door. Mama. Tessa. Her voice was quiet and absolute. Do what I said. Gideon heard the horses before he saw them. He'd straightened up from the fence line to work a knot out of his back, and he caught the sound of hooves on frozen ground, and the angle was wrong for Ruth Alderman, or anyone else who might have legitimate business out here. He picked up his rifle from where he'd leaned it against the post. Cal, standing 3 feet away, went still. Go inside, Gideon said. What's... Cal. He looked at the boy directly. Go inside, bolt the door, and stay away from the windows. Go. Cal went, running, and Gideon turned to face the 3 riders coming across the north field. He knew which one was Warren Cross before they were close enough to make out faces. He knew it the same way you know certain things about people from a distance. Something in the posture. The way the man sat the horse, not like he was riding it, but like he was tolerating it, occupying it. He was a big man, broader through the chest than Gideon, maybe 10 years younger, with a face that would have been handsome if everything about it weren't arranged in the expression of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that he was owed more than the world had given him. The 2 men flanking him were hired. Gideon could tell that too. The way they held themselves slightly back, slightly deferential, the way their eyes moved to their employer before they moved anywhere else. Not friends, not partners, paid. Warren pulled up about 30 yards from where Gideon was standing. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Gideon. He smiled, which was the most unsettling thing he could have done. "You must be the rancher," he said. His voice was pleasant, which it clearly was as a matter of deliberate cultivation. "Gideon Hale, I've been hearing about you." "You've got me at a disadvantage," Gideon said, though he didn't particularly mean it. "Warren Cross." He said his own name the way some men do, like it was a credential. "Clara's my brother's widow. I'm here to see her." He paused. Peacefully. "I just want to talk." "She know you're coming." "Well," a slight gesture with one hand, the kind of gesture that concedes nothing while implying reasonableness. "We haven't had a chance to be in touch, given circumstances. I heard she'd had some trouble on the mountain route. Naturally, I'm concerned." "Naturally," Gideon said. He held the rifle loosely, barrel down, not aimed, but present. He stood where he was and looked at Warren Cross and took the measure of him, and what he found was more dangerous than he'd expected, which was saying something because he'd expected something fairly dangerous. The man was smart. Not just shrewd, smart, with the specific intelligence of someone who had learned to read people and situations and work them. The pleasantness wasn't a mask over rage. It was a tool, carefully maintained. "I'd like to speak to Clara," Warren said again. His eyes moved briefly past Gideon to the house, and something in them went briefly flat. "Privately, if possible. This is family business. If Clara wants to talk to you, that's her choice." Gideon didn't move. "But you'll talk out here, not inside, and not privately." Warren looked at him for a long moment. The smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind it. "You're protective," he said, and he made it sound like a personality defect. "I can respect that. Man opens his door, takes in a widow and her children. Naturally, he gets attached." He tilted his head slightly. "But this is between me and my brother's family. It was before you were involved, and it'll be after." "I don't know what it was before," Gideon said. "I know what I saw in Coldwater Canyon." The smile went still. Not gone. Still. Like the face of a clock when the mechanism inside stops moving but the hands haven't fallen yet. "I don't know what you think you saw," Warren said carefully. "I know what I know." Gideon met his eyes. "And I know Sheriff Burrell in Ridgeline has a written record of everything Clara told him, with names, with dates." He paused. "That record exists whether or not anything happens out here today." It was a calculated thing to say. He said it because it was true, and because he wanted Warren to know it was true, and because men like Warren Cross, men who operated in the space between what was legal and what could be proven, generally recalibrated when you made it clear the space had gotten smaller. Warren recalibrated. Not outwardly. Outwardly, he was exactly the same. Easy in the saddle, pleasant expression, patient. But his next words came out slightly more carefully than the ones before them, which was how Gideon knew he'd landed. "I'd still like to see Clara," he said. "Just to see she's well. A man can want that for his brother's widow." "You can want it," Gideon said. "Hold on." He didn't turn his back on them. He moved sideways to the house, keeping his eyes on the three riders, and knocked twice on the door with his knuckle. A pause, and then Clara opened it. She'd already been watching through the window. He could tell from her face, from the particular set of it that said she'd had a minute to prepare. "He wants to see you," Gideon said low. "You don't have to. I know." She looked past him at Warren, and what crossed her face then was not fear exactly. It was something older than fear, something that comes from a long history of knowing exactly what a person is capable of and having to be in the same room with them anyway. "I'll talk to him." She came out onto the porch. She didn't go further than the top step. Warren's expression shifted again, and this time the shift was visible, a flicker of something that might have been relief or might have been satisfaction, and it was gone so fast Gideon almost thought he'd imagined it. "Clara," Warren said, warm as a summer afternoon, "you look well, all things considered." "Warren." She didn't match his warmth. "Say what you came to say." He took a slow breath, like a man who was being very patient with someone who didn't deserve it. "I came to ask you to stop this. Come home. Bring the children." He paused. Daniel's land is family land. Whatever lawyer you talk to in Mill Haven, whatever papers you think you have, none of that changes what the land means or where it belongs. You know that. The deed is in my name, Clara said, jointly with Daniel's, which by law passes to me. That's what the papers say, and that's what the court will say if it comes to it. I'd prefer it didn't come to it. So would I. Her voice was perfectly level. Then leave us alone. Something shifted in his face again, and this time the pleasantness peeled back far enough to show what was underneath it, just for a moment. Something impatient, something that had been containing itself for a long time and was getting tired of the work. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. No, Clara said. I'm making it exactly as hard as it is. Silence. Warren's horse shifted and he brought it back under control without looking down, which was the kind of thing that looked easy and wasn't. He looked at Clara and then he looked at Gideon, standing between them at the bottom of the porch steps, rifle still barrel down and present. You're making a mistake getting involved in this, Warren said to Gideon. Not a threat, not openly, stated like a fact, the way you'd tell a man there was a storm coming. Might be, Gideon said. I've been involved since the night her children showed up at my door half frozen. That's a hard thing to walk back from. Warren held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he pulled his horse around. Think about what I said, Clara, he called back without turning. This offer won't stay open. He rode back over the ridge the way he'd come, his two men behind him, and the sound of the hooves faded and then was gone. And the yard was quiet except for the wind. Gideon let out a slow breath. Clara sat down on the top porch step, which she clearly did not mean to do. It was the involuntary sit of legs that have finished holding tension. She pressed her hands against her knees. He'll be back, she said. Yes. Not like this next time. No. He turned to look at her. You did well. She looked up at him, and her expression said she wasn't sure what to do with that. I've been doing well for 8 months, she said. I'm very tired of doing well. He sat down on the step beside her. Not because he had a plan to, just because she looked like someone who didn't need to be stood over. They sat there for a moment in the cold, and inside the house he could hear the children's voices starting up again, the particular sound of compression releasing. He'll try to use the men from the canyon, she said. Not directly. He won't want his name on anything, but he'll use them. Those men are scattered. 2 are gone and 1's in custody. He paused. But he has others. He always has others. She rubbed her hands together, slow. He's been building connections for years. People who owe him, people he pays, people who are afraid of him. That's how Warren works. He doesn't do things himself if he can arrange for things to be done. Gideon thought about the canyon, about the operation there, the scale of it, the organization, the fact that it had been running for at least 2 years without being shut down. He thought about Sheriff Burrell's expression when he'd mentioned the canyon and the thing that moved behind the man's face before he got it under control. He thought about something he'd been turning over since they rode back from Ridgeline. The man with the shoulder wound, he said. Did Burrell send anyone to the canyon? Clara looked at him. He said he would. He said he'd send someone to look. He met her eyes. I'm going to ride out tomorrow and check. She was quiet for a moment. You think he didn't? I think there's a reason that canyon has been operating for 2 years without anyone doing anything about it. He held her gaze. I'm not saying Burrell is bought. I'm saying I don't know that he isn't. The words sat between them in the cold air. Then who do we trust? She asked. Right now? Ruth Alderman. He said it without irony. And ourselves. That night, after the children were in bed, Gideon sat at the table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter to the territorial judge in Cary Falls, which was 2 days ride east but was the nearest circuit court with jurisdiction over Ridgeline. He wrote down what he'd seen in the canyon, what Clara had told the sheriff, and what had happened in the yard that afternoon, including Warren Cross's name and the names of the 2 hired men as best he'd caught them. He was not a man who'd written many letters in 6 years of deliberate isolation, and the writing came out blunter than he intended, but he thought blunt was probably the right register for a circuit judge anyway. Clara found him when she came in for water and read over his shoulder without asking. He let her. Add the name of my lawyer, she said, Harlan Voss. He can corroborate the deed and the filing. He added it. She sat down across from him. You think the judge will act on a letter? I think a letter on record is harder to make disappear than a conversation. He folded the paper. And I think Warren's careful enough that if he knows there's a paper trail going to Carey Falls, he'll be more careful about what he does next. Buying time, she said. Buying time, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the folded letter. Then, there's something I didn't tell you about what I heard in the canyon. She said it like she'd been waiting to, like she'd been deciding whether to for a while. They mentioned a name, someone above the men in the camp, someone who ran the route, a name I didn't recognize. He waited. Carver, she said. That's all I got. No other name, no description, just Carver said and Carver wants. And the way they talked about him, it wasn't how you talk about someone you hired. It was how you talk about someone you're afraid of. Gideon turned the name over. Carver. You know it? No. But something at the edge of his memory shifted. He'd heard something once, a story in a saloon in Ridgeline, 3 or 4 years back, a piece of a conversation he hadn't been paying much attention to. Something about a man who ran freight through the canyon in summer and something else in winter. He hadn't been paying attention because he'd been making it his business not to pay attention. But I know someone who might. Ruth? Ruth knows everyone in this valley who's been here more than 2 years. He stood up and picked up the letter. I'll ask her tomorrow. Oh. He rode out to Ruth Alderman's place at first light. Ruth was already up because Ruth was always already up. And she was doing something involving a large pot and a significant quantity of intention in the yard behind her house when he tied his horse at the post. She looked up and read his face and set down the pot. Warren Cross, she said. Not a question. He came yesterday. I heard. She wiped her hands on her apron. Hal Dempsey saw 3 riders on the North Ridge Road. In this county, that kind of thing gets mentioned. She looked at him steadily. What do you need? Name, he said. Carver. Someone running an operation through Coldwater Canyon. Freight in summer, other things in winter. Ruth's face changed. It was subtle. The change of a woman who'd been in one place long enough to have knowledge that cost something to carry. Where'd you hear that name? Clara Calloway heard it in the canyon, from the men who took her. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at her pot and then at the mountains and then back at him. Silas Carver, she said. He ran freight out of Ridgeline for about 5 years, legitimately, or at least that's what anyone looking would have found. He sold the operation 4 years ago and disappeared, more or less. Nobody thought much about it. She paused. My husband, Frank, before he passed, he used to say Carver was the kind of man who was always running 2 businesses, one you could see and one you couldn't. Where is he now? That, Ruth said, is the question. She looked at him directly. What I know is that Carver and Augustine Burrell used to drink together. Used to. I don't know if they still do. I know Frank thought they did. She paused again. I'm not saying Burrell is a corrupt man, Gideon. I'm saying I don't know what he is, and when I don't know, I'm careful. He nodded slowly. That's enough. Is it? Her expression was the expression of a woman who had survived a long time on a frontier that was not gentle with women who survived alone, and who had done it by being very clear-eyed about what she knew and didn't. Carver is not a man who responds to paper trails and letters to judges, Gideon. He responds to being shut down completely or not at all. I know. Then you know what you're likely walking into. I've been walking into it since I opened my door, he said. Seems like it's mine to finish. She picked up her pot again. Send Clara to me if things go sideways. I've got a cellar room the children can use. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you offer firewood to someone who's running low. And Gideon, she stopped him as he turned. Don't let Warren Cross see you hesitate. Men like that, hesitation is the only thing they take for permission. He was 2 miles from the ranch on the way back when he heard it. The smell first. Smoke, but not wood smoke. Not the controlled smell of a hearth fire. The kind of smoke that's wrong before you see it, that hits the back of your throat and tells you something is burning that shouldn't be. Then he came over the rise and he saw the barn. He spurred the horse into a run. The barn was fully engaged by the time he got into the yard. The left side of the structure was bright with fire from the inside out. orange light pushing through the gaps in the old boards, smoke pouring from the roof vent and the hayloft door. The horses were screaming inside, and it was that sound that hit him hardest, the trapped animal sound, and he was off his horse before it had fully stopped and running for the barn door. The crossbar was down from the outside. Someone had latched it from the outside. He got the bar up and dragged the door open, and the smoke came out at him like a fist, and for a second he couldn't see or breathe. He dropped low, pulled his bandana over his face, and went in. The horses were in the near stalls, his own mare, and the old gelding he used for field work, and the two horses that had belonged to Clara. He worked from the far stall first, got the gelding's lead, didn't bother with a knot, just pushed the door open and hit the animal on the flank, and shouted until it moved. He got Clara's two out the same way, losing 30 seconds fighting with the latch on the second stall because the heat had warped the metal. His own mare he didn't need a lead for. She knew the way out, and she took it the moment the door was open. He came out of the barn low, coughing, eyes burning. Cal was in the yard, which was where Cal was not supposed to be. He was standing with a bucket, and his face, when he saw Gideon come out of the smoke, did something that Gideon didn't have time to look at. "Are the horses out?" Cal demanded. 12 years old, bucket in hand, voice steady with the wobble just underneath it. "All four. Go back inside." He was already turning, looking at the barn, assessing. The left wall was gone, effectively. The right wall was still mostly standing. The roof was going. Nothing was going to save the structure, and he stopped wasting thought on saving it and turned to the house. "Where are the others?" "Inside. Mama's inside." Cal hesitated. "There were two men, Gideon. I saw them before the fire. They came from the tree line." Gideon grabbed his arm. "You saw them. From my window. I saw them go to the barn." His jaw was trembling now, though he was fighting it. "I yelled for Mama. She said stay inside and she—" He stopped. "She what?" "She went to the window with the rifle." Gideon was already moving toward the house. He went in the front door and found Clara in the main room with Gideon's Winchester leveled at the side window, which she'd opened 2 inches. She didn't take her eyes off the window when she heard him come in. "Two men," she said. "Tree line. They didn't come closer after the fire started." "They wanted to see if we'd run out," he said. "Get clear of the house." "I know." Her voice was steady in a way that told him it had cost her something. "They're still there, eastern edge of the pines." He crossed to her and she handed him the rifle without discussion, and he took the window position and she moved back toward the hallway where the children were. He looked out through the 2-inch gap at the pine tree line, which was 80 yards out, and saw nothing for a moment. Then one of them moved, just slightly, shifting weight, and the winter light caught the pale of a face between the trees. 2 men, both mounted, watching the barn burn and watching the house. He thought about Ruth's words. "Don't let him see you hesitate." He opened the window all the way, raised the Winchester, and put a shot into the tree line about 4 feet to the left of where the face had been. Not at them. Close enough to make a point. Both horses moved immediately, and then both riders were moving, pulling away from the trees, and in 10 seconds they were on the slope heading north, and in 20 they were over the ridge and gone. He stood there for a moment with the window open and the cold air coming in and the smoke from the barn drifting across the yard. His hands were shaking slightly. He noticed it the way you notice things at a distance, with the calm that comes in the middle of something that will be much less calm later. He closed the window. When he turned around, all 5 children were in the hallway doorway, and Clara was in front of them with her hand back against the nearest one, Danny, who had his face pressed against her arm. "Is it over?" May asked. "For now," Gideon said. Tessa was looking at him from the back of the group. She had her siblings arranged behind her in a way that was so natural she probably hadn't thought about it. Her body between them and the room, the same instinct he'd seen on the first night. She looked at him, and then at the window, and then back at him. "They'll come back," she said, not asking. "Yes," he said. "They'll come back." He wasn't going to lie to her. She was owed the truth, same as always. "Then what do we do?" she asked. He looked at all of them, at the 5 children and at Clara, who had picked up Danny and was holding him against her side with one arm and looking at Gideon over his head with an expression that was holding more than it was showing. He looked at the smoke drifting past the window. He looked at his hands, which had stopped shaking. "We sent for help," he said.
Cal frowned. Sheriff Burrell.
Not Burl. He picked up the rifle and set it on the table and went to the drawer where he kept paper. We send to the Territorial Marshal in Cary Falls tonight by Fast Rider. He sat down. And we get Ruth. You think the marshal will come? Clara asked. I think Warren Cross just burned down my barn with my horses locked inside it. He picked up the pen. That's not frontier justice. That's arson and animal endangerment, and it's a criminal matter that goes above a county sheriff. He looked at her. And I think whoever Burl is or isn't, there is a circuit judge in Cary Falls who has never drunk with Silas Carver, and a territorial marshal's office that has been looking for a reason to investigate this canyon for a long time. He said it with more certainty than he fully felt, because that was what was needed. But it was also mostly true, which helped. Clara set Danny down and straightened up and looked at him for a long moment. Write the letter, she said. He wrote it. Outside, the barn finished burning in the cold, clear air, and the smoke went up straight in the still afternoon, visible for miles in every direction, a signal that no one had planned and everyone would see. Warren Cross had stopped being careful. That meant he was close to something, close to the edge of what he could control, or close to what he'd decided was his, or both. Men like him only stopped being careful when they thought the game was almost over. Gideon sealed the letter and gave it to Cal with instructions and watched him ride toward Ruth Alderman's place, upright in the saddle, moving fast through the snow-covered field. Then he went back inside and started thinking about what came next. Because whatever it was coming whether he was ready or not. Cal made it to Ruth Alderman's place in under 20 minutes, which was faster than Gideon had expected, and which said something about the boy that Gideon filed away for later. Ruth came back with him. She came on her big gray mare with a rifle across her saddle and a canvas bag tied behind it. And she came without being asked twice, and without making a production of it, which was the Ruth Alderman way of doing things. She took one look at the smoking remains of the barn, and at the children on the porch, and at Clara standing in the doorway, and she swung down from the horse and said, "Anyone hurt?" "No," Gideon said. "Good." She handed her reins to Cal. "Water her and tie her in the south field, away from the smoke." She looked at Gideon. "The letter sent? I gave it to her boy Emmett. He rides fast and he owes me a favor." She came up the porch steps. "Cary Falls is 2 days out. Marshal Deacon runs a tight office. If your letter's half as clear as you usually are, he'll move on it." She paused at the door and looked back at the barn. "Warren Cross is a damn fool if he thinks burning a barn stays quiet in this valley." "He's past caring what stays quiet," Gideon said. "That's the problem." Ruth looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has been underestimated and survived it long enough to recognize the same situation approaching others. "Then he's going to make a mistake soon," she said. "Men like that always do when they stop being careful. The trick is not to be standing in front of the mistake when it happens." She went inside. That night they rearranged the ranch with the particular logic of people preparing for something they couldn't fully predict. Ruth took the main room with the rifle Gideon gave her, which she accepted without comment and checked with the efficiency of someone who'd handled firearms her whole life. Clara moved the children into the back bedroom and put the heaviest piece of furniture, the cedar chest, against the door from the inside, not because it would stop anything serious, but because it would slow things down, and slowing things down was sometimes enough. Gideon took the porch and the yard. He didn't sleep. He sat on the front step with his rifle across his knees and watched the ridge line and the tree line and the slope below the north pasture, and he let the cold keep him awake because the cold was reliable in a way that willpower sometimes wasn't after a long day. Around 2 a.m, Clara came out with a cup of coffee. She sat down beside him without asking, same way she'd been doing things over the past weeks. Not asking permission for her own presence, not apologizing for it, just arriving and being there. It was a quality he'd noticed early and had come to value without quite articulating why. "You should sleep," he said. "Rosie's up." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "She's not fussy, just awake, watching things the way she does." She paused. "Ruth's with her. Ruth's with a 3-month-old baby at 2 a.m. Ruth said, and I'm quoting, that she's sat up with worse company." Clara's mouth curved briefly. "I believe her." He almost laughed. He covered it with a drink of coffee. They sat in the quiet for a while. The night was clear and cold and enormous. The kind of sky you only got this far from town, where the stars went all the way to the horizon in every direction. He'd stopped seeing it years ago, the way you stopped seeing the inside of your own house. Having people around seemed to have brought some things back into focus. "I've been thinking about the circuit judge," Clara said. "The letter you sent." "What about it?" "What if Warren moves before the marshal gets here, before the judge can act on anything?" She turned the cup in her hands. 2 days to Carey Falls, 2 days back. That's 4 days minimum. Longer if Deacon has to assemble men or coordinate with Burl's office. "That's the window," Gideon said. "I know. So what do we do in the window?" He looked at the dark line of the ridge. "We don't give him a clean shot at us. We keep eyes on the approaches. We stay in the house after dark. We don't go out alone." He paused. "And I'm going to talk to some people in the morning." "What people?" "People who've been in this valley a long time." He turned the cup. "Parker Wells has the ranch 2 miles south. Tom and Petra Vidal are 6 miles east past the creek. There are 3 or 4 other families spread across the valley who have been watching the canyon situation longer than I've been paying attention, and who have their own reasons to want it resolved." He looked at her. "I've been isolated here by choice. That was my choice, and it made sense to me at the time. But choice runs in both directions." She was quiet for a moment. "You think they'll help?" "I think they've been waiting for someone to ask," he said. "That's how it usually works. People don't volunteer into a fight that isn't certain, but if you come to them with something real, something they can stand behind, they'll stand." She looked at him. In the starlight, her face was all shadow and line. The tiredness in it, but something else too, something that had been there from the beginning, and that he'd come to think of as the core of her. Not optimism exactly, not stubbornness exactly, but the specific kind of persistence that doesn't require a reason to feel good about the future, just a reason to keep moving toward it. "You didn't used to think that way," she said, "about people." "I used to think a lot of things that turned out to be about me and not about people in general." She turned back to the dark. "Daniel used to say the same thing about himself after his worst years, that he'd been mistaking his own anger for evidence." She paused. "It took him a long time to see it." "Smart man," Gideon said. "Sometimes," she said, and the softness in it was complicated. Grief and affection, and something else that was neither. He was smart sometimes. They sat until the coffee was gone, and Gideon told her to go in and get whatever sleep she could before dawn, and she went without argument because she was practical enough to know that rest was a resource and she was running low. He sat and watched the rest of the dark run out of sky, and he thought about what was coming, and he thought about what Ruth had said about mistakes, and he was still thinking when the sunrise started laying itself out along the eastern ridgeline, in shades of orange he had no good word for. He rode out at first light, and he rode to 4 places in 6 hours. Parker Wells was 62 years old and had been in the valley for 20 years, and had never particularly liked Gideon, which was fair because Gideon had not gone out of his way to be liked. He listened to what Gideon said from the porch of his house with his arms crossed, and his face doing the careful thing that old faces do when they're deciding something. Then he said, "Heard about the barn last night. Emmett Ruiz rides fast and he's got a mouth on him." He uncrossed his arms. "Tell me about the marshal." Gideon told him. Wells said, "I'll come. I'll bring my son." Tom and Petra Vidal were the kind of married couple that operates as a single entity on questions of principle, and the entity said yes before Gideon had finished talking. Petra, who was small and dark, and had a quality of contained force that reminded him slightly of Clara, asked 3 precise questions about the canyon operation, and the timing, and what exactly the plan was. And when he answered, she nodded once and said, "Tomorrow morning, we'll be there." The Fitch brothers, 2 of them, Lee and Davis, who ran a sheep operation on the west side of the valley and who had lost 2 of their own people to the canyon trail the previous winter, didn't need much convincing at all. Lee just said, "We've been waiting for someone to do something about that canyon for a year and a half," and Davis said, "I'll saddle up now if you want." And Gideon said tomorrow morning would be better because they needed everyone at once. He rode back to the ranch by noon. Ruth was on the porch, and she told him before he'd even dismounted, "Someone was watching the road this morning. I caught movement in the tree line twice. They're keeping track of who comes and goes. Let them watch, Gideon said. We're not hiding. She looked at him for a moment. You got people? I got people. Something moved in Ruth's face. Not quite relief, but the expression of a woman who has carried a great deal of weight alone for a long time and has just been told that some of it is going to be shared. She didn't say anything about it. She just nodded and went back inside. Clara heard what he'd done when he came in and told her, and she sat at the table for a moment, not saying anything, looking at her hands. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, and he didn't push it. They're coming for us, she said finally. These people. For a situation that has nothing to do with them. It has something to do with them, he said. The canyon's been preying on this valley for 2 years. Everyone out here has lost something to it, or knows someone who has. He sat across from her. And you're not nothing to do with. You're here. You're their neighbor, even if you haven't been for long. She looked up at him. I've been here 3 weeks. Neighbors on the frontier don't usually wait 3 years to make up their minds. He put his hands on the table. Clara, people help when they're asked. It's the thing I forgot when I came out here and shut the door. I thought I was being self-sufficient. I was mostly just making sure no one could let me down. He paused. Let people help. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Not like a woman who'd been convinced, but like one who'd already arrived at the same place and just needed someone else to say it out loud. All right, she said. What? Warren came back on the second day. He came in the afternoon, and he came with 8 men. Gideon saw them from the roof of the house, where he'd been keeping watch since noon. 8 riders coming down the north slope in a loose formation, no pretense of a social call this time, no friendly pace. They came like men who had made a decision and were implementing it, which was exactly what they were. He came down from the roof. Ruth, he said, get Clara and the children to the back room. Bar the windows. I can shoot, Ruth said. I know you can. Get them settled first, then come back. She went. He went to the front window and looked at the riders and counted again. 8, he'd had it right. And he thought about Harker Wells and the Vidals and the Fitch brothers, who were supposed to arrive in the morning and who were therefore not here now, and about how the timing of things never quite lined up the way you needed it to. He heard the back bedroom door close. He heard Clara's voice, low, talking to the children. He picked up the Winchester and went to the front door. He opened it and stepped out onto the porch. Warren Cross pulled up in the yard, same position as before, same easy posture. But there was something different about him today. The pleasantness was gone, stripped off, and what was underneath was something older and less patient. He looked at Gideon on the porch, and he looked at the rifle, and he didn't rearrange his expression. Last chance, Warren said. Clara and the children come out and come with me, and you walk away from this. That's the offer. That was never an offer, Gideon said. That was you telling a woman what to do. I'm telling you what happens if you keep standing in the middle of something that's not your business. You burned my barn, Gideon said. That made it my business in a way that doesn't reverse. Warren looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the man on his left and gave a small nod, the kind of nod that has a specific meaning, and 2 of the riders started to move around to the sides of the house. Gideon raised the rifle. Don't, he said. They stopped, but they didn't go back. He did the math he'd been doing since noon. 8 men, him, and Ruth, if she came back, which was 2 against 8 in an open engagement, which were not numbers anyone would choose. He kept the rifle up and kept his face neutral and looked at Warren Cross and thought about what Ruth had said about mistakes. And then he heard horses, not from the north slope, where Warren had come from the south road and from the east, and he counted, yes, from the west tree line as well, and the sound built from a few hooves to many, and Warren turned in his saddle and looked south, and what he saw was Harker Wells coming over the southern rise with his son beside him, and the Vidal couple coming from the east with 2 men Gideon didn't know, but who were riding with them, and from the west, the Fitch brothers and 4 others, and at the front of the group from the south, slightly ahead of Wells, was a man Gideon didn't recognize immediately. He had a badge on his coat. He was not Sheriff Burrell. The man pulled up in the yard in a way that took up the space between Gideon on the porch and Warren Cross on his horse, and he did it with the particular competence of someone who had positioned himself between armed parties before and knew how to do it without anyone shooting accidentally. Marshal Deacon, he said, and he said it to the yard at large rather than to any one person. Territorial Marshal's Office, Cary Falls. I've got warrants for the arrest of Warren Cross on charges of arson, criminal conspiracy, and complicity in the operation of a trafficking network in Coldwater Canyon. He paused. I've also got a warrant for Silas Carver, but that one's going to take another day. The yard was very quiet. Warren Cross did not move for a moment. He sat very still, and Gideon watched him and saw the moment when the calculation happened. The rapid, comprehensive assessment of the situation, the men surrounding the yard, the badge, the warrants, and saw the moment when the calculation came out wrong. When Warren understood that the thing he'd been building toward was not going to arrive the way he'd planned. "Marshal," Warren said, and his voice was even, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been a misunderstanding," Deacon agreed pleasantly. "Someone thought this was going to go differently." He looked at Warren directly. "Step down from the horse, Mr. Cross, slowly." One of Warren's men made a move, hand going toward his hip, and 3 rifles came up from the assembled riders on the south and east, and the man's hand stopped moving. Warren stepped down from the horse. It took most of the rest of the afternoon to sort out. Marshal Deacon had come faster than expected. He'd gotten Gideon's letter and the one from Clara's lawyer in Mill Haven simultaneously, and he'd been building a case on the Canyon operation for almost a year through his own channels. The letter hadn't been a revelation so much as a trigger point, the final piece of a picture he'd been assembling from fragments. He'd ridden out with 2 deputies and made contact with the Valley ranchers on the way, following up on an earlier communication that Gideon hadn't known about. Ruth Alderman, apparently, had sent her own letter to Cary Falls 6 months ago, a letter that had gone into a file and been waiting for something to connect it to. "You didn't tell me about that," Gideon said to Ruth later when things had settled enough to have a conversation. Ruth looked at him with the expression she reserved for questions she considered slightly beneath her. "You'd been hiding on that ranch for 6 years," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd want to be involved." "I'd have been involved." "Well," she said, "now you are." Now, Warren Cross and 3 of his hired men were in custody by sundown. The other 5, when they saw the direction things were going, had taken their horses and disappeared back up the north slope, which Deacon said was fine because they were small fish, and the warrants that mattered were the ones he had. Silas Carver, as Ruth had predicted, was a longer problem. He wasn't in the canyon. He'd cleared out when word came through about the incident 3 weeks ago, which meant he'd known about it almost immediately, which meant his network of information was better than anyone had accounted for. Deacon put out an alert through the territorial office and said, with the measured honesty of a man who didn't make promises he couldn't keep, that it might take a while. "How long is a while?" Claire asked him. They were in the main room of the ranch, all of them, the children and the Valley families who'd come, Ruth, Deacon, and his deputies, the whole complicated assembly of a crisis that had arrived and then needed to be processed. Deacon was a compact man of about 50 with a trimmed beard going gray and the particular quality of stillness that seemed to be a requirement for his line of work. "Weeks," he said. "Maybe longer. Carver's been running for years. He knows how to not be found." He looked at her directly. "But the operation is done. We've got 3 witnesses from the canyon. The man with the shoulder wound talked, which is why I had enough for warrants by the time I got your letter. The network's been exposed. Even if Carver surfaces somewhere else, he can't rebuild here." Clara nodded. She took that in with the same methodical quality she took most things, weighing it, accepting the parts that were real, not inflating them. "And Warren? The arson charge alone is 3 to 5 years. With the conspiracy and the trafficking complicity, the judge in Cary Falls is going to take a long time with that case." Deacon paused. "He's not coming back to bother you soon, Mrs. Calloway. And when he does, there's going to be a very thick record waiting for him." Tessa, sitting at the edge of the room with Danny pressed against her side the way he always was when things had been frightening, looked up at that. She looked at Deacon and then at Gideon, and something in her face that had been braced for a long time, weeks, maybe months, maybe longer, shifted slightly. She didn't say anything, but she let go of a breath Gideon wasn't sure she'd known she was holding. By evening, the Valley families had gone home, exchanging the kind of words people exchange when they've done something together that matters and aren't quite sure how to market without making it larger than it is. Parker Wells shook Gideon's hand on the way out, which was the most either of them had ever put into an interaction, and it was enough. The Vidals brought food, Petra had apparently anticipated a long day and packed accordingly, and left a significant portion of it behind, which fed everyone through the evening. Deacon and his deputies camped in the south field. He'd offered to ride back toward town, and Gideon had said there was enough room and it was late, which was true. And also he wasn't quite ready for the ranch to be quiet again, which he didn't say. The children ate at the table that night, all 5 of them, with Ruth and Clara and Gideon, and it was loud in a way that the ranch had never been in Gideon's memory of it. Danny had 1,000 questions about the marshal and the badge and the horses, and May wanted to know exactly what would happen to Warren at trial. And Cal was quiet, but in a way that was thoughtful rather than frightened. And Rosie sat in Clara's lap and looked at the chaos around her with the wide-eyed equanimity of a baby who has spent her whole life in a state of emergency and has decided to find it interesting. Tessa helped with dishes after. Gideon was drying them. It was a 2-person job when there were this many plates. And they worked in silence for a while, which was comfortable in the way silence between 2 people can be when they've been through enough together. "I thought you weren't going to make it," Tessa said at some point. She wasn't looking at him, just working. "When?" "When we were walking in the snow. I thought we were going to die before we found anything." She set a plate in the rack. "I didn't say it out loud." "I know. I knew if I said it, Danny would hear it." She paused. "And I didn't actually believe it, not all the way. I just thought it." She handed him another plate. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. "That's usually how it works. You think the worst thing, and then you keep moving anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you did? After your wife and son?" He stopped drying for a second. "More or less," he said. "Except I stopped moving after a while. That's the part I shouldn't have done." She accepted that without comment, the way she accepted most things, taking it in and not making a performance of it. She had, he thought, the particular quality of a person who listened with her full attention, which was rarer than it sounded. "What happens now?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "With us. With this." She gestured vaguely at the house around them. "The marshal goes back, the neighbors go home. Then what?" He set down the plate he was drying. He looked at the wall for a moment, and then he looked at her. "That depends on what your mother wants," he said. "I haven't asked her yet." Tessa looked at him sideways, with an expression that told him this was not information she'd needed to hear because she'd already been aware of it. "You should ask her," she said. "I intend to." She handed him the last plate. "Tonight would be good," she said, with the directness of a 12-year-old who has decided that adults are generally too slow about the things that matter. He almost smiled. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He found Clara after the children were settled, sitting on the porch step. Not the same way she'd sat there when she was frightened or exhausted, differently. She was sitting with her hands loose in her lap, looking out at the yard, and the posture was the posture of someone who had set something down after carrying it for a long time. The barn was still a burned-out shell at the edge of the yard. He was going to have to rebuild it, which was a significant amount of work. He'd been thinking about where to start. He sat down beside her. "Deacon said he'll send word when Carver surfaces," she said. "He will." "Do you believe him?" "I do, actually. Deacon's the kind of man who follows through." He looked at the ruins of the barn. "Carver's on borrowed time. The network's gone. Without the canyon operation, without the protection he had through whatever arrangement he had with Burl, he's exposed. A man like that, once he's exposed, someone always finds him eventually." "Eventually," she said. "That's honest." "I know." She looked at the barn, too. "I'm sorry about it. The barn. I'll rebuild it." He paused. "Be better the second time. I've been meaning to fix the roof pitch on it for 3 years anyway." She looked at him sideways. "The roof pitch? It let water in at the northeast corner every spring. You're talking about barn architecture." "I spend a lot of time thinking about practical problems," he said. "It's a habit." She laughed, a real one, shorter than a laugh, but real, and it changed her face the way laughter does. He caught the edge of it and held it for a moment before it was gone. "I need to ask you something," he said. She turned toward him. "Stay." He said it the same way he'd said most of the important things in the past few weeks, straightforwardly, without dressing it up. Not because there's nowhere else to go, or because it's winter, or because of the road. Stay because this is where you are. And it's been better having you all here. He paused, and what he said next cost him something because it had been a long time since he'd said anything like it. I didn't think it would be. I was prepared for it to be harder. It wasn't. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had the expression of a woman hearing something that requires careful handling, not because it's fragile, but because it's real, and real things deserve to be answered honestly. The children need stability, she said, which was not an answer, but was part of one. I know. Tessa needs to be a child again. She hasn't been one in a while. She looked at her hands. Danny's still having nightmares. May is fine, but she's been watching me like she's afraid I'll disappear again. She paused. Rosie doesn't know anything is wrong, which is either a blessing or evidence she's the most resilient of all of us. Probably both, he said. Probably both, she agreed. She looked back out at the yard, the burned barn and the south field where the marshal's camp was, and beyond it, the mountains going dark against the last light, and the sky above them going from orange to the deep, layered blue of early evening. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I have opinions about most things, and I express them. I noticed. You're not particularly talkative. No. That could be a problem. It hasn't been so far. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not the guarded thing, not the evaluating thing, something a level beneath those. No, she said. It hasn't. Silence. The good kind. Ask me again in the spring, she said. When the snow's gone and we've had time to live through more than a crisis. Ask me when it's ordinary. He nodded. Spring, he said. And in the meantime, we rebuild the barn. We rebuild the barn. She turned back to the dark, and he sat beside her, and the ranch was quiet around them in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of a place where the worst has passed, and what's left is the business of continuing, which is its own kind of hard, but a different kind entirely. Somewhere inside the house, Rosie made a sound. Then Danny said something muffled by the walls, and Tessa's voice answered him, and there was a pause, and then whatever it was resolved itself, because the house went quiet again. Outside, the first stars were coming out over the ridge. Gideon looked at them and thought about spring. Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes does in high country. Reluctantly, in pieces, the snow retreating a few feet and then returning overnight as if reconsidering. March was cold and February had been brutal, and there were days in between when the world outside the ranch windows looked exactly the same as it had the night Tessa brought her siblings in from the blizzard, and it was hard to believe that anything had changed at all. But things had changed. They had changed in ways that didn't announce themselves, that showed up instead in the texture of ordinary days, in the sounds the house made, in the rhythms that had established themselves without anyone deciding they should. Danny stopped having nightmares sometime in February. Not all at once. It was a gradual thing, the bad nights becoming less frequent, the sound of him calling out in his sleep becoming something that happened once a week and then once every 2 weeks, and then barely at all. He had taken to following Gideon around the ranch with a devotion that was equal parts 6-year-old hero worship and something more practical, a hunger for a specific kind of steadiness that he hadn't had for a while. Gideon bore this with patience that surprised even himself. He didn't talk much, but Danny had discovered that Gideon would answer questions if you asked them directly and didn't ask too many at once, and so he developed the habit of asking one careful question per morning, waiting for the answer, and storing it away before asking the next day's question. It was a system that seemed to work for both of them. May had stopped watching the door. That was how Clara put it to herself. In February, when she first noticed. May had spent the first weeks at the ranch, stationed near whatever exit was closest to wherever Clara was, positioned with the unconscious vigilance of a child who has learned that mothers can disappear without warning and has decided the solution is proximity and attention. Slowly, without any particular turning point, she'd stopped. She'd started spending her mornings with Rosie instead, which had turned into an enterprise of considerable organizational ambition. May had decided that Rosie needed to be educated, and had begun a curriculum of her own devising that consisted mainly of showing the baby objects and naming them with the focused intensity of a teacher who takes her students very seriously, regardless of their current capacity to respond. Rosie, for her part, had opinions about this. She expressed them loudly and frequently. She was 4 months old and then 5, and then nearly 6. And each month she became more herself in ways that were both recognizable and startling. And Clara would sometimes hold her in the evening and feel something that was complicated to name, grief for the months she'd almost lost her, and gratitude so large it was almost uncomfortable, and the specific tenderness of a mother looking at the youngest child and understanding, in her body rather than her mind, that this one had almost not made it. Cal rebuilt the barn. That was not accurate. Gideon rebuilt the barn with help from Harker Wells's son and 2 of the Vidal hands, who came over on 3 separate weekends in January and February. But Cal was there every day, and somewhere in the process, he'd stopped being a helper and started being something closer to an apprentice. He learned which end of a nail to hit. He learned how to read a level. He learned that Gideon had specific and strongly held opinions about roof pitch, specifically the northeast corner, which had let water in for 3 years and was going to be corrected this time if it took twice as long as the rest of the roof, and that arguing with those opinions was possible if you had a reason, but required that you actually have a reason, not just a preference. By February, Cal was waking up early. That was the tell. A 9-year-old who wakes up voluntarily before he's called, in winter, because there's something he wants to get to. That's a 9-year-old who has found something that matters to him. Clara watched this happen from a careful distance, not wanting to name it too loudly and change it somehow, the way certain things shift when you look at them directly. Tessa was the hardest to read. She was always the hardest to read. She did her work and she helped with the children, and she was by any measure functioning well, better than well, in the way that Tessa tended to function, with a competence and consistency that was almost architectural. But Clara knew her daughter, and she knew that functioning was not the same as being okay, and that Tessa had a habit of putting the okay off until everything else was handled. It was a habit Clara recognized because she'd built it herself, and passing it on to her daughter was not something she was proud of. It was Gideon who noticed first, which caught her off guard. He mentioned it one evening in January, mentioned it in the particular way he mentioned things, as a statement placed on the table for consideration rather than a question requiring an answer. Tessa's carrying something she hasn't put down yet, he said. And then he went back to what he'd been doing, and Clara stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and thought about how it was possible that this man, who'd been alone for 6 years and who expressed emotional insight about as frequently as the weather changed direction, had seen something she'd been circling around for weeks. She talked to Tessa the next afternoon. Not a formal conversation. She knew better than that, knew that formal conversations with Tessa produced formal answers. She sat beside her while she was mending a shirt and just started talking, about nothing important, about the barn going up and Ruth's opinion of the roof pitch, and the way Rosie had grabbed Danny's nose that morning, and his genuine offense at the violation. Tessa laughed at that. A real laugh, quick and unguarded. And then Clara said, in the same conversational tone, "How are you actually doing?" Tessa was quiet for a moment. She folded the shirt in her lap. "I keep thinking about the shoes," she said. Clara knew immediately what she meant. "Mama, not in a bad way. I don't dream about it anymore." She turned the shirt over. "I just think about how I found them, and I thought something was wrong with me because I couldn't. I didn't cry. I thought maybe I was broken, that a normal person would cry, and I just got everyone up and started walking." "You weren't broken," Clara said. "I know that now." She looked up. "But I didn't know it then. I thought, what's wrong with me? And then I thought, I'll figure that out later. There are more important things." She paused. "And then there were always more important things." Clara set down what she was holding and looked at her daughter, 12 years old, going on something much older. "There's nothing wrong with you," she said. "Not then, not now. You did exactly what needed to be done. That's not a defect. That's who you are." She paused. "But you don't have to always be the one doing what needs to be done. That's not your only option." Tessa considered that. "Gideon said something like that," she said, "about himself, about shutting the door. Smart man." "Sometimes," Tessa said, which was exactly what Clara had said about Daniel 8 months ago. and the echo of it made Clara's chest do something complicated. Sometimes, she agreed, and then Tessa put down the shirt and leaned sideways against her mother's shoulder, which she hadn't done since she was maybe 9 years old, since she'd decided she was too old for it and had seemed to mean it. Clara put her arm around her and held her there and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. The news from Carey Falls came in pieces, through March. Marshal Deacon sent word first that Warren Cross's trial had been set, then that it had begun. Then, on a Thursday in late March, when the snow was finally, grudgingly retreating from the south-facing slopes, that it had concluded. The verdict arrived in a letter that was also signed by Harlan Voss, Clara's lawyer, who had apparently attended the proceedings in person. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Gideon across from her, and the children doing various things in the rest of the house, and Ruth, who had come for the week, sitting by the fire pretending not to be paying close attention. Warren Cross had been convicted on all charges: arson, criminal conspiracy, complicity in the operation of a trafficking network. The sentence was 14 years. Clara set the letter down on the table. She didn't say anything for a moment. 14 years, she said. Gideon looked at her. That's what it says. He'll be 62 when he gets out. She looked at the letter and then at the ceiling and then at her hands. Daniel would have been 60 by then. She paused. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it, Gideon said. It's just a number. It's just a number, she repeated quietly. And then she looked up and something in her face let go. Not dramatically, not in tears, just a slight release. The expression of someone who has been bracing against a door for so long they'd forgotten they were bracing, and now the door was locked from the other side and would stay that way. Voss had also written separately about the deed. With Warren's conviction and the associated investigation, any challenge to the property in Callaway's former county had been formally dismissed. The land was hers, legally and completely, and the record had been updated accordingly. He'd enclosed the updated documentation, which Clara set beside the letter and looked at without touching for a moment. The land, she said. Yes. I haven't thought about what to do with it. The land. She looked at Gideon. I could sell it. It's mine to sell. That would be something. It would. Or I could rent it, find a tenant. She turned the letter over in her hands. It was Daniel's land before mine. He built the house on it. She was quiet for a moment. I don't want to go back there. I've known that for a while. I just didn't say it because I wasn't sure I was allowed to. You're allowed, he said. She looked at him. Is that what you think, or is that what you're hoping? He held her gaze. Both, he said, which was the honest answer. She looked at the letter again. I'll write to Voss, she said. Ask him to find a tenant, someone who'll take care of it. She set the letter down with a finality that was different from the finality of earlier say. This was chosen, deliberate. And I'll write to the county clerk and update the address of record. To here? He said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the kitchen, the table with its collection of nicks and scratches, the stove she'd learned the specific temperament of over the past months, the window that faced east and let in the morning light at an angle that landed on the floor in a pattern she'd come to recognize. She looked at the door to the hallway and heard, through it, May's voice reading something aloud to Rosie, and Danny's voice asking Cal something about the fence, and Tessa's quieter voice answering instead. To hear, she said. Wong. Silas Carver was found in April. Not by Marshal Deacon, as it turned out, but by a deputy marshal in a town called Ritter's Crossing, 400 miles west, where Carver had apparently been attempting to establish a new version of what he'd lost in Coldwater Canyon. He'd been careful and he'd been patient, and he'd gotten about 8 months into a new operation before someone who'd heard about the Coldwater Canyon arrests made the connection and sent word east. Deacon wrote to say that Carver was in custody and that the territorial court expected to take longer with his case than it had with Warren's. The charges were more extensive, the documentation more complex, and there were 3 other counties involved in the investigation. He expected it would be a year before it went to trial. Gideon read the letter and showed it to Clara, and neither of them said much about it, because by April they had other things on their minds. The south field had been planted, or the first part of it had. The barn was finished, the roof pitch corrected to Gideon's satisfaction, the stalls rebuilt larger and better ventilated than before, and they'd added a fourth horse to the stable. A young mare Harker Wells had sold them at a price that was notably below market, in the way that neighbors sometimes settle debts that were never formally incurred. The kitchen garden was in, May and Clara working it on alternating mornings, an enterprise that had produced so much optimistic planning that Gideon privately estimated they'd be eating more squash than was strictly good for anyone by August. He didn't say this out loud. He'd learned when to keep his opinions to himself, which was a thing he'd known theoretically for years but was understanding more practically now, in the specific context of living with 5 other people rather than in the theoretical context of living alone. The learning ran in both directions. Clara had come to understand over the winter that Gideon's silences were not moods, that they were simply a different way of being present, that the man who didn't say much was often paying close attention to everything, and that the things he did say were worth taking seriously precisely because he hadn't said 17 other things first. She'd had to adjust her expectations of what conversation looked like, which had required more patience than she'd expected, and also she'd occasionally been less patient about it than she would have preferred, and they'd had 3 arguments over the winter that were honest arguments, and not the kind that got tidied up too fast. The first had been about the kitchen stove in January. She'd wanted to adjust the flue in a way that increased the heat draw, and he'd said the draw was fine, and she'd said it was not fine, and she'd been cooking on this stove for 2 months, and she knew what it was doing, and he'd said he'd built the flue himself and understood how it worked. And they'd gone back and forth about it for 10 minutes with escalating definiteness until she actually went and adjusted it, and he went out to the stable and came back an hour later and said, without inflection, "You were right about the draw." She'd said with equal inflection, "I know." And then they'd had dinner, and that had been that. It was not a smooth system, but it was a real one, and real ones were what mattered. He'd asked her again in April, the way he'd said he would. It wasn't a moment that had been planned, at least not consciously. They were walking the fence line in the south pasture in the early evening, the light long and level, the air still cold but with something different under it, the particular smell of ground that's about to grow things again. The children were in various places on the ranch behind them, which they were old enough now to manage, and the walk had started as a practical survey of what needed repair, and had turned into something else, without either of them deciding it should. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Spring," he said. She looked at him. "You said ask you in spring," he said, "when it's ordinary." She looked around at the pasture, the fence line, the ranch in the late light, the smoke coming from the chimney of the house in the distance. She thought about ordinary, about what it had meant before and what it meant now, about how the word had changed shape over the winter in ways she hadn't expected. Ordinary used to mean bracing. Ordinary had meant Daniel's absence and Warren's presence and the weight of 5 children in a world that had decided to be more difficult than she'd planned for. Ordinary had meant managing, containing, surviving the next thing. This ordinary was different. It was the ordinary of a stove that she'd adjusted and that now drew correctly. It was the ordinary of knowing which board on the porch step creaked and stepping over it out of habit. It was Danny's one question per morning, and Cal's early rising, and May's teaching curriculum, and Rosie's opinions, expressed at volume, about everything she encountered. It was Ruth Alderman arriving uninvited and unapologetically helpful. It was the Vidals and the Fitch brothers and Harker Wells's son, who'd come back twice after the barn raising just because, it seemed, they'd gotten used to coming. It was Gideon, standing beside her on a fence line in April, asking a question she'd already answered 3 months ago in the kitchen. "Yes," she said. He nodded, like he'd known but needed to hear it said. "There are things I need to tell you," she said, "about Daniel, about the years before I left. Things you should know before this is more than it already is." "I know," he said. "I have things too. I know you do." "We'll have time," he said. "We'll have time," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, not a gesture he'd made before, and she felt the slight uncertainty in it, the unpracticed quality of it, which was somehow the most honest thing about it. She didn't say anything. She held on. They stood there for a moment, and then they started walking again, because the fence line still needed checking. What nobody tells you, Clara thought, in the weeks that followed, is that healing is boring. That was not quite the right word. Not boring, but ordinary. It was ordinary in ways that the crisis had not been, And after months of crisis, the ordinary took adjustment. Danny had good dreams and bad dreams, and the bad ones came less often, and the good ones he reported in enormous detail over breakfast, in a way that required everyone to maintain interest for longer than was strictly manageable. May outgrew her boots and needed new ones and was very specific about what she wanted, and had opinions about the boots Gideon brought back from town that were frank and detailed. Cal broke a fence post trying to repair it, and had to be talked through the combination of frustration and embarrassment that came with making a mistake in front of someone whose opinion you cared about. And Gideon did the talking in his particular way, not minimizing the frustration, not inflating it, just addressing it as one practical fact among others. Tessa turned 13 in May. They made her a cake, which was Ruth's project, and which Ruth executed with the absolute confidence of someone who does not believe in modest gestures. It was 4 layers, which was at least 2 layers more than the occasion strictly required. And it was not beautiful in any conventional sense because Rosie had gotten her hands into the frosting at a critical moment and left the impression of 2 small palms on the top tier. They left the impression there. Tessa said it was the best cake she'd ever had, which may or may not have been true, but it was clearly the right thing to say because it made Ruth look as close to flustered as Ruth ever got. After dinner, after the cake, after the children had drifted to their various evenings, Tessa found Gideon on the porch. She sat on the step beside him, which she did sometimes now, just sat the way he sat, looking out at the ranch in the evening light. "I've been thinking about what I want to do," she said eventually. "What do you mean?" "When I'm older, what I want to be." She looked at the stable, the new barn, the south field going green at the edges. "Mama always said we'd figure it out when we got somewhere safe. We'd figure out what everyone wanted." She paused. "I think I want to be a lawyer." He turned to look at her. "Because of Harlan Voss," she said. "Because of what a paper can do, what a record can do. Warren had all those men and all that money and all those connections, and what stopped him was a piece of paper in a courthouse." She looked at her hands. "That's real power. Being the person who knows how to make those papers mean something." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a long road," he said. "Women lawyers? It's not common yet." "I know." Her voice was even. "It'll be more common by the time I get there." He sat with that for a moment. Then, "You'd be good at it," he said. "You're methodical. You think in sequence. You don't rattle easily." He paused. "You'd have to study, a lot, more than what you're doing now." "I know." She looked at him. "Would you? Is there a way to get better books? Better than what we have?" "I can write to Voss," he said. "Ask him what he'd recommend for someone starting early." She looked at him with the particular look she had, the look that was evaluating and direct and that had seen through most of the things people tried to tell her since she was 8 years old. Then she nodded. "Good," she said, like it was settled. It was apparently settled. He wrote to Voss the next week. Voss wrote back with a list of books and also, at some length, about Tessa's stated interest in terms that made it clear he found the idea more than interesting. He mentioned a school in Cary Falls that had recently begun admitting young women to its preparatory program. He mentioned that if the girl was serious, there were paths that could be built, and that he had some small experience in building them. Gideon showed the letter to Clara. She read it twice, then she folded it and held it for a moment. "She's 12, she said. 13. I know. That's years away. I know." He sat down across from her. "But Voss is right that the path is built early or not at all." He looked at her. "What do you think?" She thought about it. She thought about the girl who'd carried her infant sister through a blizzard and not cried, who'd found the shoes in the snow and gotten everyone moving, who'd sat at a table at the end of the world and read a deed and asked the right questions. "I think," she said, "that if Tessa wants to be a lawyer, she's going to be a lawyer." She set the letter down. "And I think we're going to need more bookshelves." Summer arrived without announcement, the way summer does in high country. Suddenly, fully, like someone opened a door. The south field came in, and the kitchen garden exceeded even May's most optimistic projections, and the squash situation was exactly as Gideon had privately predicted, and worse. Rosie began crawling in July, which transformed the entire character of the house, because nothing below knee height was safe anymore, and she had strong opinions about where she was and wasn't allowed to go that ran directly contrary to everyone else's. They were, in other words, a family. Not the kind that gets described as perfect, because no family is that, and the ones that claim to be are lying or miserable or both. They were the kind that left dishes in the sink and argued about the fire and lost things and found them and stepped on each other's silences and sometimes needed to be left alone and sometimes needed to not be left alone and couldn't always tell which was which. They were the kind that had history, which meant they had things that didn't get talked about and things that got talked about too much and things that were slowly, year by year, finding their way from one category to the other. Gideon learned over that summer and the fall that followed what it was to be a person again, rather than a caretaker of his own grief. He didn't arrive at this understanding all at once or without backsliding, because that's not how it worked, and anyone who told you different had probably never lost something serious. There were days in late autumn when the light came through the window at a certain angle, and he thought about Eleanor and the boy, and it hit him the way grief always eventually does hit you when you've stopped bracing for it, directly, with no warning. He'd stand there for a moment and let it land, and then he'd go back to what he was doing, because that was what you did with the parts of life that didn't resolve. You carried them and kept moving, and the moving didn't mean the carrying got lighter, just that your arms got stronger. He told Clara about this once, late at night in October, sitting at the kitchen table. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Daniel had a laugh you couldn't dislike. That was the thing about him. You could be furious with him, and he'd do that laugh, and you'd just—" She stopped. "I still miss the laugh." She looked at her hands. "I love what I have here. I genuinely love it. And I still miss the laugh." "I know," he said. "That's allowed?" "I think so," he said. "I think it has to be." She nodded. "Good," she said. "Then we're all right?" They were all right, not in spite of the missing, but around it, the way a tree grows around something that doesn't move, taking the shape of the obstacle until the obstacle becomes part of the shape. The letter from the territorial court came in November, nearly a year after the night Tessa brought her siblings to Gideon's door. It was the notice of Silas Carver's conviction. Gideon read it on the porch, in the cold, and when he came inside he set it on the table and Clara read it, and then she walked to the window and looked out at the yard without saying anything for a moment. "It's over," she said. The words came out quieter than she'd expected, and she thought about all the times she'd imagined saying them. On the road, in the wagon, in the months of moving when the idea of over seemed like something that happened to other people. She'd imagined it would feel larger. She'd imagined it would feel like the end of something unbearable, a door closing with force and finality. Instead, it felt like setting down a bag you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped noticing the weight. Just down. On the ground, not dramatic, just done. "Yes," Gideon said. She turned around. The kitchen was warm and the house was full of the sounds it was full of now. May's voice and Danny's and Cal somewhere in the back, and Rosie's irreducible opinion about something, and Tessa's quieter presence moving through the middle of all of it. "I want to do something," she said, "to mark it. Not a big thing. Just something." He thought about it. "We could go to town." "The whole family." "The whole family," he said. "We could have dinner at the hotel. Burl's been replaced. There's a new sheriff named Aldous who seems to actually do his job." He paused. "We could go to town and have dinner and come home." It was not a dramatic gesture. It was, in fact, an ordinary one, which was exactly what it should be. "Yes," she said. "That." They went on a Saturday, all 6 of them, which required more logistics than a cavalry movement and took 45 minutes longer to depart than anyone had planned, and resulted in Rosie being dropped and retrieved twice before they made it out of the yard. The road to Ridgeline was better than it had been in winter, passable and clear, and they made it in 2 hours, arriving in early afternoon with the children in various states of excitement and irritation from the proximity. Ridgeline had not changed much. The hotel was still there. The general store, the telegraph office. The sheriff's office with a different name on the board outside. But they walked the main street and they were not invisible. Harker Wells' son saw them from across the street and raised a hand, and Cal raised one back with the ease of someone who belonged here, which he did. Petra Vidal was at the general store and came out to the porch and said something to Clara that made her laugh. A real laugh, the kind that surprised her. And they stood talking for 10 minutes while the children explored the immediate area under Tessa's supervision. At the hotel, the man behind the desk was a large, deliberate person who looked at the assembled Calloway Hale party and said, without blinking, "Table for 6?" and led them to a table by the window without making them feel that 6 was an unusual number. The dinner was not remarkable food. It was frontier hotel food, which meant it was hot and filling and prepared without particular ambition, but it was eaten in a room full of warm light and the sounds of other people and 5 children who were, for once, in a contained space with no immediate responsibilities. Danny ate an extraordinary quantity of bread. May had a very detailed conversation with the woman at the next table about something that seemed to relate to fabric. Cal and Tessa talked across the table in the low, rapid way of siblings who've developed a private shorthand, and Rosie sat in Clara's lap and ate mashed potato from a spoon and looked out the window at the main street with the concentrated attention of someone taking inventory. Gideon sat at the end of the table and watched all of this happen. He had not sat at a table like this in 7 years. He had not expected to sit at one again, which had been a choice he'd made without fully acknowledging it was a choice. The closed door, the unmarked trail, the lamp in the window that he'd kept without knowing why. He'd thought he was being practical. He'd thought he was being careful. He'd thought he was protecting himself from something. What he'd actually been doing, he understood now, was waiting. Not consciously, not with any particular hope, but waiting, the way certain things wait without knowing they're waiting until whatever it is they need arrives. He looked at Danny across the table, still working on the bread. He looked at May's animated gestures. He looked at Cal listening to something Tessa was saying with the expression of someone who is being told something he doesn't agree with but will think about. He looked at Clara. She was looking at him. Across the table, across the noise and the warmth and the ordinary chaos of a family at dinner, she was looking at him with the expression he'd come to know. The one that wasn't performing anything, that wasn't managing anything, that was just her seeing him clearly and letting herself be seen back. She raised her glass slightly. He raised his. It was not a grand gesture. It was the gesture of 2 people who had each survived something hard and who had, mostly by accident and partly by stubbornness, and partly by the particular grace of a blizzard on a night that could have gone entirely differently, found their way to the same table. On the way home, with the children asleep or nearly so in the wagon and the road silver under the early winter moon, Clara said, "I want to write it down." "What?" "What happened? All of it. The road, the canyon, the winter." She looked at the road ahead. "Not for anyone else, for them. So they have it when they're older, so they know what they came from." "From a blizzard," he said. "From a blizzard," she said, "and from each other." She looked at him sideways. "And from a man who kept a lamp in the window, even when he'd given up on expecting anyone to come." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that's what I was doing," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the thing about the best parts of people. They do them before they decide to." The ranch came into view over the last rise, the dark shape of it, the house and the barn and the south field sleeping under the first thin frost, the lamp in the front window that Clara had lit before they left, visible from the road. Gideon looked at it. He thought about the night a year ago when a girl had appeared at the edge of that lamplight with a baby against her chest, and the look of someone who had burned through hope and was running on something else. He thought about the choice he'd made in that moment. Not a thought-through choice, not a strategic one, just the most basic choice a person can make, to open the door. He hadn't known what he was letting in. That was the thing nobody understood about the big moments. They didn't look like big moments when you were in them. They looked like cold and snow and an inconvenient knock on the door at the worst possible time. They looked like a woman's shoes in the snow, and a rifle, and a canyon, and a barn on fire, and a letter to a judge, and a conversation on a fence line in April. They looked like ordinary things, one after another, until you looked back and saw what they'd made. He pulled the wagon up to the gate and helped the children down. Danny groggy, May half asleep on her feet, Cal steady as always. And Tessa, who hadn't actually been asleep at all, climbed down on the other side and took Rosie from Clara's arms without being asked. They went inside. The fire was low but not out. Gideon put wood on it while Clara settled the children, and Tessa saw to Rosie with the efficiency that had become, over the year, entirely natural. The house filled with the small sounds of bedtime, the sounds of people winding down, of a day being concluded, of enough that was also enough. Gideon sat at the kitchen table after everyone was in bed. He sat there for a while without doing anything, which was something he'd always been able to do and which now felt different than it used to. Less like emptiness and more like the quiet after music stops, when the room still holds the shape of the sound. Clara came back in. She sat across from him with a cup of something warm. "They're all down," she said. "Good." She looked at him. Outside, the wind had come up, the way it did at night out here. Not a threatening wind, just the wind, doing what wind does in high country, talking to itself across the ridges. "Are you all right?" she asked. It was a question people asked each other all the time without particularly meaning it, but she asked it the way she asked most things, meaning it, wanting the actual answer. He thought about it. He thought about Eleanor and the boy, and the 7 years of being careful not to want anything. And he thought about a night in November when the snow was coming sideways, and he'd opened the door because the alternative was unthinkable. And he thought about all the ordinary things that had followed. The soup, the argument about the stove, the fence line in April, the table at the hotel, the lamp in the window. "Yes," he said. "I am." She held his gaze for a moment, checking. Then she nodded, because it was true, and she could tell. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, the fire held. The lamp stayed on.